Lord of Industrialization. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 76 Rough Paper Book. 5 days of relentless spring rain were followed by a bright, sunny day. The farmers, seizing the moment, toiled in the fields like bees among the flowers. Meanwhile, the wicked landlords had erected awnings over the fields, brewing hot tea, chilling fine wine, and setting out cream cakes, enjoying the spring sunshine. Frederick sat on the carpet, casually plucking some nearby milk vetch and weaving a purple wreath. With matters at his estate in order, he had time to play with a little girl. "Maria," Frederick called out, and Maria, dressed in her hunting clothes, immediately ran over. Frederick stood up and placed the wreath on the little girl's head. Maria immediately smiled and ran to the flower field to ask her mother if she looked good. Sophia set up her sketchpad and painted the purple sea before her. Under the awning, Grand Duke Dalberg of Mainz listened quietly to Frederick's account of the events leading up to his father's canonization and the events in Constantinople. After listening to this, Dalberg downed half a glass of beer, remained silent for a moment, and finally said, "I have so much to say, I don't know where to begin." He had initially assumed Frederick had privately approached him to borrow money, but he hadn't expected such a major event. "Let's start with the simple things," Dalberg said, putting down his glass and picking up a piece of cream cake. "The Constantin family did a good job. The Wesson family lacks experience and talent, so this method can win them over. What I'm most satisfied with is that you set the church and that focus at war. How many people have lived for decades to figure that out? Tell me about that cathedral. What are your thoughts?" He then glanced at the church renderings beside him and took another long sip of beer. Frederick had come here primarily to visit Maria, and secondarily to reach some consensus with the Grand Duke of Mainz on certain issues. "The Germans are like weeds in the field right now," he said slowly. "They need someone to weave them into a rope." Dalberg's eyes suddenly sharpened, and he fixed Frederick with a steady gaze. After a moment, he brought up a seemingly unrelated matter. "Last year, there was a serious conflict between the Pest Kingdom and the Osmag Empire. What do you think caused it?" Frederick shook his head. The Pest Kingdom was located northeast of Wessenland, north of the Osmag Empire, and west of the former Second Plan Empire. It was too far away. Dalberg took a sip of his wine and spoke with a tone like a volcano about to erupt. "The Pest Kingdom and the Osmag Empire are fighting for control of the land between the east bank of the Elbe River and the Odra River, which once belonged to the Second Plan Empire. It was all inhabited by Germans, but now they've become a pig's knuckle, shared by the Wends and Goths. Haha, now it depends on who's more powerful, the Pest-winged Hussars or the Osmag Empire Hussars. Who can ride roughshod over the Germans and act with such arrogance?" With that, he drained the beer from his large glass in one gulp. Frederick picked up the barrel and poured beer into his empty glass, understanding his point. The Goths of the Osmagorian Empire were a branch of the Germanic peoples. Their language was similar to that of the Confederation of the Rhine, though customs varied slightly depending on the region. If the Germanic people were pure tofu, the Goths were tofu seasoned with certain ingredients. And Dalberg expelled them from the tofu category. To the Grand Duke of Mainz, the impending war was like two bandits fighting in their own home to decide who would take their property. "I understand what you mean," Frederick said. He had experienced a similar situation once in his hometown. Dalberg took a sip of beer, picked up Frederick's cream cake, and devoured it. After finishing, he took another sip of beer to calm himself. Frederick was speechless. He wanted to eat with Maria later when she returned from her fun. Dalberg put down his glass and asked, "What are you going to do?" Frederick reached for the cloth-covered basket behind him and pulled out a thick book, handing it to him. Dalberg accepted the world's 10th thread-bound, paper block-printed Holy Codex, with a puzzled expression. This spring, Katie and Keller began experimenting with making paper from pine wood, with initial success. Frederick took the papal canonization given to him by Archbishop Victor at the Winter Spirit Festival the previous year, carved the wood blocks, then cast the copper plates. He then used Katie's improved oil paint as ink, and recently ran a test print. After a few initial errors, the canonization, whose quality wouldn't be slashed by the Church of Light, was finally printed. While the cost hasn't been calculated yet, it's clear it's significantly cheaper than parchment. Some of these books were collected, while others were rushed to the Holy City to be sent to Richardinal and his colleagues. Frederick took one of them. Dalberg flipped through it and asked, "What is it made of?" Frederick replied, "Something like wood. It's lighter and cheaper than parchment, and ordinary people can afford it. It can not only print the Holy Bible, but also other books. I have a lot of books shipped from Constantinople. I plan to set up a translation court to print all those books into Rhine. I also plan to edit the German books, folk tales and songs I have and print them. Other people can come to me to print books. If they are foreign language books, I will ask the translation court to translate them into Rhine. I also plan to build a library to collect all kinds of books that can be found through printing and translation, and make it a palace of knowledge for the Germans. I would like to ask you for a favor." Dalberg immediately understood the meaning. His face was flushed with excitement. When he heard that he wanted help, he immediately asked, "What do you want me to do?" Frederick said, "I would like to ask Your Excellency the Grand Duke to organize people to compile a Rhine dictionary to unify the writing and standard language of Germans everywhere." Then he said in a very low voice, "Someone is preparing to translate the Holy Bible into Rhine." "All right," Dalberg roared. "I'll take care of this. I'll go back tomorrow to arrange it." Frederick had learned of the faction within the Church of Light that was vying for the translation of the Holy Codex through Archbishop Victor. Dalberg then asked, "Is there anything else I can help with?" Frederick, not wanting to miss the opportunity, said a little sheepishly, "Building a library is expensive. While we can make money from book sales later, we still need some initial capital." Dalberg fell silent, his rough hands caressing the rough gray cover of the Holy Codex, as if hesitating. Frederick felt a little uneasy, fearing he would be angry. After a moment, Dalberg gritted his teeth and said, "No problem. I still have some private money here. I originally planned to leave it to my children after my death, but I will use it to build a library for you." Frederick immediately said, "Thank you for your generosity. This library will be named after you and will always be open to your family." "No need." Dalberg shook his head slightly, looked at the mountains in the distance, and said in a somewhat ethereal tone, "Let's call it Edelweiss. I hope those Goths don't forget some important things." Frederick was stunned, and immediately understood what he meant. No matter whether you add salt, sugar or chili to tofu pudding, it is still tofu pudding. Maria, wearing a wreath of flowers, ran over and asked Dalberg, "Godfather, why are you shouting so loud?" Dalberg reached out and stroked Maria's dark hair. He softly asked, "Philip's not home much these days. Can I ask Frederick to come visit you more often?" Maria nodded immediately and said, "Sure." Then she looked at Frederick and asked, "Do you really come visit me often?" Frederick smiled slightly and replied, "Of course I do." "That's great." Maria jumped for joy and pulled Frederick along. "Come on, let's go play with the wings and see who can fly the farthest." Frederick nodded to Dalberg, then stood up and went to play with Maria's wooden dragonfly. Dalberg sat there, fumbling with a rough-hewn Bible in his hands. He slowly opened the book and read it word by word, his expression filled with reverence and seriousness. Chapter 77 Paper-Making Machines. "Hey, you're back." Katie saw Frederick in the restaurant and a strange smile crossed her face. "Why don't you stay with Maria for a few more days?" Frederick sighed, silently eating breakfast. He'd wanted to stay for a few more days, but he'd said the paper and printing weren't the best yet and could be improved, so the Grand Duke of Mainz kicked him out overnight. There was nothing he could do. He'd been promised a large, low-interest loan to expand the paper and printing plants if he could produce better products. He had to comply with the investors' demands. Meanwhile, Frederick had confirmed that the Grand Duke of Mainz's math skills were pathetic. He could only calculate interest rates in 10-point increments. If she hadn't suggested reducing the interest rate by 2 points, he'd been unable to figure out the interest rate for ages, and Maria would have laughed at him. He was probably still playing Monopoly with her. After breakfast, Katie, as usual, boarded the carriage to the paper mill, only to find Frederick and Taro had also entered the carriage. "Come to my place today?" Katie asked him with a smile. "I know I have beautiful young girls everywhere," Frederick replied with a smile. "A beautiful older girl is enough." Katie pinched his face and said, "Then go to the kitchen." Frederick remained silent, brooding. Katie and Taro chatted about the latest fashion trends for this spring. The carriage left the city and arrived at the distant riverbank. From afar, they could hear the tinkling sound of craftsmen nailing beams to the roof. The red bricks used in the factory buildings were imported from their southwestern neighbor, Wessenland. The bricks fired there were of high quality and low price, making them a hot commodity in the surrounding area. Count Rees had a bad relationship with Frederick. He had played a role in the disaster and later followed King William's lead in trapping the victims in Wessenland. Naturally, he would not sell bricks to Frederick to build houses for them. However, of Count Rees's 10 knights who returned from the war 2 years ago, only one returned with a missing left hand. 3 sons died, 2 younger ones, the eldest was frightened into a dummy, and there were no grandchildren. The lord was consumed by alcoholism and feuding over the succession, leaving the castle in disarray. With no energy to manage matters, his subordinates became more active. Late last year, Frederick's merchant, Janus, secretly established a connection with the steward there and began purchasing large quantities of red bricks at cost price in exchange for the latter's son attending Wittenberg University. This year, Janus, using the steward as a middleman, has connected with even more officials. The guilds of Rees County even secretly organized artisans to travel north to work, alleviating Wesson County's shortage of skilled labor. After getting off the bus, Katie went to the construction site to inquire with the foreman. She's been researching inks lately, so she's been less involved. Fortunately, the artisans here are already familiar with the work and can make their own arrangements. Frederick strolled around the area and then came to the woodshed near the pilot production line. A large crowd had gathered here today, many of them students from Almight, gathered around 2 machines and chatting with Kohler. "What are you selling?" Frederick asked with a smile. They were all acquaintances. And he recognized the leader, a student named Schmidt. "Hello, Principal," the students greeted Frederick immediately. Frederick waved as a gesture of greeting, then walked over to one of the machines, patted it, and asked with a smile, "Are you here to sell us new machines?" Schmidt immediately stepped beside the principal and said with a broad smile, Yes. We know you value the paper-making workshop so much, and knowing that you still engage in a lot of heavy, repetitive manual labor, you designed and manufactured these machines." Frederick, feigning ecstasy, said, "Is this a gift for us?" Schmidt and the others nearly burst into tears. Frederick smiled and examined the machine. Its main power source was a magical reciprocating motor, and judging by the shape and size of the magical muscle, it was a high-torque type. The machine's main moving parts are 3 hollow steel rollers, approximately 20 centimeters in diameter and 1 meter long. They're assembled from several sections and feature horizontal grooves on their surfaces to increase friction. One roller is mounted on the main frame and driven by the machine, while the other 2 rollers are mounted on a movable frame, which can be moved back and forth by a button-activated magic muscle, adjusting the distance between the 2 rollers. Beneath the active roller is a long, sharp blade made of high-strength elemental steel. A conveyor belt, located beneath the machine, transports items. Schmidt, with a smug smile on his face, asked Frederick, "Principal, do you know what this machine is?" Frederick smiled and said, "Not bad. You've actually thought of that." He pointed to the center of the 3 rollers and said, "Put a piece of wood in there. When the machine is turned on, it will rotate the wood and press it against the blades, thus slicing it into thin sheets like cloth." Shock filled Schmidt and the others' faces. "Principal," Schmidt asked cautiously, "isn't it that you've been to the smithy lately?" "Who told you that?" Frederick rolled his eyes at him and said matter-of-factly, "It's simple enough, I can tell at a glance." Kohler chimed in, "Don't you see who the principal is? How can you compare yourself to him?" Schmidt and the others immediately exclaimed, "Principal, you're brilliant." Schmidt then added, "Principal, what do you think of this machine? It'll be great for cutting logs, arrow shafts, and even log stakes." Frederick nodded and said, "It's a great machine. Use it here first to gain experience. When you think you can build a factory, come to me and I'll invest in you." "Thank you, Principal, for your help," Schmidt shouted excitedly, and his classmates beamed as well. Everyone knew that getting the principal's attention was a surefire way to make money. Frederick said earnestly, "When designing machines, you should also consider the safety of the users. Workers are here to earn money, not to die. For example, this machine could have a conveyor belt to load the wood. First, it would save people the effort of lifting so high, and second, it would keep them out of harm's way. You have to understand, the people using it are not as smart as you. You can't imagine what they'll do with this machine. I wouldn't be surprised if someone let a pig in." Then the guy's expressions turned strange. Frederick was startled and asked, "Who's so stupid?" A voice replied, "Professor Almight." Frederick blinked, pretending nothing had happened. He turned to look at another machine and asked, "Is that a slicer?" It looked like a guillotine. It had to be that. Schmidt nodded and replied, "Yes, yes. The blades on top press down as soon as it's turned on, and you can change the blades to any size, making it very convenient for cutting wood or paper. Parchment books also need to be trimmed after binding, and based on their experience, they've developed a trimmer that can cut a variety of things." Frederick looked over and said, "I have 2 suggestions. First, add a conveyor belt to the wood cutting machine and connect it directly to the machine over there." He gestured. "Second, if the machine requires manual unloading, use 2 switches spaced far apart, pressed simultaneously to start it. That way, no one unloading the material accidentally hits the switches and cuts off their fingers. Like I said, be careful." Schmidt immediately remembered. Frederick said, "I'm planning to research a new machine soon. I need to focus our efforts, first learn, then work." Schmidt immediately asked, "Principal, what machine are you going to build this time?" Frederick smiled and replied, "This time, we're going to make history." The crowd erupted in excitement. Schmidt asked cautiously, "Principal, can you tell me what it is?" Frederick curled his lips and said, "Boil water." Chapter 78 Technological Innovation. Frederick asked Schmidt and the others to slowly adjust the machines while he and Curler inspected the paper being trial produced. "What do you think of those 2 machines?" Frederick asked. Curler replied, "I think they're excellent. Schmidt's even willing to give me credit, saying it was made with university research funds and I can pay him back over time." Frederick's mouth twitched. They approached a pile of thumb-sized wood chips. Curler said, "These are cut using a saw. Compared to machines, it's very time-consuming and labor-intensive." Frederick nodded, squatting beside the wood chips to pick them up and examine them. Curler continued, "We've found the cause of the grayish color of our last paper production. The pine bark inside the wood chips wasn't cleaned properly. Schmidt's machine can remove the bark first, so the paper will be wider in the future." Frederick nodded, stood up, and watched the workers sorting the wood, removing the darker ones. The thin wood chips were taken to the stove outside and steamed in a large pressure cooker. Frederick noticed the workers pouring the water from the pine wood steaming process into a water vat and then covering it. "Curious?" he asked. "What's this for?" Curler explained, "The water from steaming the pine wood chips contains pine oil, an unexpected byproduct that can be used in printing ink." Frederick nodded in satisfaction. This hadn't been the case before. Furthermore, Psyche had originally steamed the chips in a double boiler, like steamed buns, but now, in a large pressure cooker, it significantly reduced the time. Frederick was pleased that they were able to exercise their initiative. The same process was followed for the subsequent acid cooking process. Instead of boiling the thin wood chips and diluted slime acid directly in the ceramic pot, the pot was covered and placed in a pressure cooker, heating it in double boiler. This reduced the cooking time from 3 hours to 1. During the acid flushing phase, Curler apologized. "It's reasonable to say that some of the used acid can be reused, but we haven't found a way yet." Frederick calmly said, "That's okay. We can research it slowly. The wastewater and residue need to be properly handled. The amount is small now, so it's hard to tell. But if it gets bigger, the entire river might be wasted." He had witnessed the devastation of industrial pollution in the 1980s and 1990s in his previous life. A small factory killing an entire river's flora and fauna was no joke. Curler nodded and took note. During the pulping phase, several stone mills were powered by magic reciprocating machines, making them much more efficient than water. Frederick saw several young students recording data while adding additives to the pulp, so he went over to take a look. Curler explained, "We record every step, every formula and every result, and are ready to find the best from them. Last time we found that the printed paper was still very rough. After discussion, we felt that there were gaps in the wood fibers, so we decided to add some finer straw fibers to fill it, which had a good effect." Frederick said very satisfiedly, "Very good, very good. This is very good. Different places require different papers. If you master the rules, you can meet different needs." Next to the paper-making trough, several workers skillfully used a scoop net to scoop up the pulp. Keller showed Frederick a scoop net and said distressedly, "We're using a copper wire net right now, and it leaves marks on the paper." Frederick smiled and said, "It can't be helped, but it doesn't matter. Just adjust the distance between the marks and treat it as a built-in line." Keller shrugged and said, "That's the only way I can think of it." Frederick took the paper copying frame and studied it. He pondered, "I think we could weave a pattern on it with fine copper wire, marking the finished paper. That way, Customers would know which paper is ours. Keller paused for a moment, then thought it made sense. He asked, "What pattern are you planning to use?" Frederick frowned and thought. These days, trademarks often use plants and animals, and many of them are now used. Why not durian? The problem is, Psyche and Madame Sophie were probably the only people here who had seen this thing. Madame Sophie's logbook was empty for a few days. Later, it was said that it was because a sailor who went ashore to find fresh water brought back several giant, thorny devil fruits. He ultimately settled on a traditional design, using magical elements to draw in the air. He then said, "Let's use a simplified castle design, with a quill in the middle." Keller thought it was a good idea and took note. The paper, removed from the copying net, was lightly squeezed to remove some moisture before being placed in the first roller-type dehydrator. This dehydrator had a smooth conveyor belt made of slime glue, which conveyed the paper between two smooth, hard rubber rollers to squeeze out a large amount of moisture. The paper was then passed to the next dehydrator, where smooth steel rollers pressed out the moisture and smoothed it even further. Schmidt made this machine, too, Keller said. He said they modified some existing machines in the blacksmith shop. Frederick nodded and said, "Yes, these two rolling mills were originally supposed to produce steel plates, but now they have a less powerful power source, so they'll work well here." The blacksmith's rolling mill was obtained, using the manual mill used by jewelers to roll gold, silver, and lead sheets as a reference. They simply enlarged and strengthened the components, and after some detours, they finally succeeded. The two dehydrators before him were actually made from recycled scrap. Their frames and screws weren't as strong as steel, but they handled paper with ease. Frederick suddenly thought that the rollers used in the wood-cutting peeling machine were probably also the product of a flawed process. Casting and forging such long steel rollers in one go was difficult, as the surface would be uneven. Someone suggested assembling them in sections, but that didn't work. Frederick surveyed the area and then went with Keller to Katie's office. It felt like a laboratory, with shelves lined with colorful bottles and jars. "Are you back from playing?" Katie asked, mixing ink. "Are you hungry?" Frederick's lips curled up, noticing a rosy blush on her cheeks. "It's too messy here," Frederick said quickly. "I'm going to Keller's office." With that, he gave Keller a look and ran off, grabbing Taro, who had been quietly following behind. When Katie reappeared before Frederick, her face was clean. She pinched his cheek angrily, and Frederick immediately felt her greasy fingers. Taro, standing by, immediately took out a handkerchief and wiped the ink off Frederick's face. He rubbed it several times, his face red, before finally getting it clean. Keller, stifling a laugh, turned away from the legendary genius principal. Frederick pouted and dragged Katie toward the printing area. Chapter 79. Print a few books. The printing area is dozens of meters away from the paper-making site, leaving room for future development. The artisans here are high-spirited. They'd been working overtime printing the Holy Scriptures a while ago, and since then, they've all received bonuses and a few days off, so they've just returned to work today. Frederick and Katie first visited the plate-making area. Carpenters were busy carving master plates for letters of varying sizes. These plates weren't used directly for printing, but rather as metal molds. Previously, when printing the Holy Scriptures, carpenters first carved the wooden molds, flattened them with a flat plate, and secured them with hot slime glue before printing them on sand molds. However, considering the large-scale printing, copper molds were cast, and the surface of the molds was then smoothed and polished. The final test prints were a mess. The main problem was the handwritten letters, which couldn't be printed in thin sections, and the ink bleeding into close sections caused them to blend together. Katie stepped in, redesigning the printing type on the spot, making the strokes uniform in thickness and spaced appropriately. She also adjusted the ink formula to reduce the amount of oil used. The second test print was a success, but it only printed on one side, and the ink still seeped through to the back. So, drawing on her experience with oil painting, Katie added a little turpentine to the linseed oil-based ink, and it barely passed muster. A little oil still seeped through to the back, so she'd have to find a solution in paper production. Next came the arduous and tedious work. Many of Weissenberg's scribes were called in, tasked with assembling the typefaces according to the content and proofreading them. The scribes' jobs would be impacted by the printing press, so it was helpful to have them acclimate to their new duties in advance. The printing machines were new, high-tech products. Ahmet had modified a batch of presses. Once the typefaces were set up, the ink was applied, and the paper was edited, A foot switch was pressed, and the magic muscle-controlled platen pressed down. Finally, the pages were arranged according to the page numbers, and holes were drilled, threads were threaded, and edges trimmed. As everyone walked and watched, Katie said to Frederick, "Schmidt said he has a way to improve the printing machine and make it faster, but the strength of the paper needs to be increased." "Oh?" Frederick asked curiously. "Did he say how to do it?" Katie shook her head and said, "I don't know. He said a lot of things about the core." At this time, Claire said, "Schmidt said that he plans to use the core of the golem puppet to control the printing press, allowing the paper to pass through the conveyor belt. After the machine determines that it has reached the position, it will stop and print the words, and then pass it out. It will also apply ink by itself, and we are only responsible for putting the paper in." He also said that if our paper and ink are good, we can also print double-sided at a time. Frederick nodded slightly, thinking that this guy is so amazing, he might as well mention the binding machine to him to see if he can figure it out. Katie led Frederick to the typefaces, picked up a wooden frame, and said, "I've got a great idea. Make the paper a fixed size, then divide a colorful painting into different templates, one color per template. As long as the paper is printed with different colors, you'll end up with a colorful painting." Frederick nodded, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Sister Keller," he said seriously, "I have a problem. Can you produce thick, hard paper that's printed well and smooth on both sides?" Katie asked, "What's your new evil plan?" Frederick smiled and said, "You don't want to play with those thick, heavy wooden playing cards anymore, do you?" There were playing cards these days, but they were made of thinner wood, which was heavy and difficult to shuffle. "I see, you're just imagining weird things." Katie poked him on the head in annoyance. Frederick's face lit up with a strange smile. A ghost, the ghost of a raccoon, hovered in the air. As they chatted, they headed towards Keller's office. The place was also filled with shelves filled with trial papers, along with the corresponding production processes and formulas. Frederick studied them curiously, picking up a piece and examining it for a long time, tears streaming down his face. "This paper should be prioritized," he declared firmly. Katie took a look and asked, "Why produce this?" "It's not strong, it's too soft, and it absorbs water. It'll spoil if it gets wet." Frederick turned to Taro and said, "Come and see if this paper can replace handkerchiefs for wiping things. Just use it and throw it away." Katie tapped him on the head and said, a little annoyed, "You're so wasteful at such a young age." Frederick, desperate for toilet paper, immediately said, "Sister, you don't understand. For those wealthy nobles, wasting money is a sign of prestige, a way to prove their wealth." Taro chimed in, "That's true. Gentlemen all value ostentation, but our master is still young." "That's right," she thought suddenly, putting down her shoulder bag, and dragging Katie outside, mumbling for a long time. After the two of them finished their mumbling, they returned to the office as if nothing had happened, but their eyes were filled with "Don't ask." Everyone settled in. Curler showed Frederick a sample and said, "This is an improvement on the previous paper. Removing the bark makes it much wider, and adding straw fibers makes it much firmer and smoother. According to experience, adding a little more agar will allow for double-sided printing." Frederick took it, examined it, and thought it was quite good. He then asked Taro to pull out a few books from his bag. He placed the books on the table and said, "These are my previous books, as well as the work I've done this winter. If the paper and ink are acceptable, we'll print 100 copies of each and pay the market price." Curler replied, "We recently did a cost calculation. The cost of a book the size of the Bible is 4 copper coins per 10 sides, and the market price is 1 copper coin per side. There's no discount for double-sided printing." Frederick blinked, wanting to ask if he had traveled through time from a printing shop, and why there was no discount for double-sided printing. He asked again, "What about the blank pages?" Curler replied, "Less than 60% finished." Frederick thought for a moment. This edition of the Holy Scripture would be the size of a large 32-mo volume, about 600 pages. The printing cost here would be 6 crews, plus 8 crews to sell to the Church of Light, who would then add a little more to sell it to believers. This price was still affordable for the average family. After all, a copy would last for many, many years. The number of pages he wanted to print this time wasn't that outrageous, and his potential customers were scholars and those with more financial resources, which made the cost even lower. "I think it's okay," Frederick said, pushing the book in front of him forward. "Let's print these first." Katie knew he'd been writing all winter, but this was the first time she'd seen anything like it. Curious, she flipped through it. She'd heard of the nature of light, He'd sent it to Venice, and asked for help finding a lens grinder, but they were hard to find. She heard one was recently in jail, so she thought they might be able to rescue him. The three properties of forces and the energy of motion, and a conjecture on why we stand on the earth was incomprehensible, and she yawned. The combination of algebra and geometry. What is a plane rectangular coordinate system? What is analytic geometry? Factory management manual. What is this? She seemed to understand a little, but also seemed to not understand. Katie flipped through a few books, feeling a little dizzy. After finishing a book, she took it from Curler and flipped through it. No one should miss a book by a genius principal. Then she sat there, motionless. At lunchtime, Frederick and the others went to lunch, and a few more people with books in their hands appeared in the office. Schmidt and the others finished debugging the machine and went to find Curler. Seeing him reading, they didn't disturb him and picked up a book on the table to read. After lunch, Frederick quickly slipped back to the castle to avoid being blocked by questions, and then closed the door to visitors, saying that they didn't need to come unless it was important. In the days that followed, Frederick continued his morning classes and practiced magic and martial arts, and then spent the whole day in his study writing and drawing. Book prices are based on the Song dynasty. In 1059, the collected works of Du Guangbu was sold in Suzhou. It was 21.7 centimeters high and 15.5 centimeters wide, with 940 pages containing approximately 188,000 characters. The book, sold at a low profit margin and high volume, sold for 1,000 yen, or about 1.06 yen per page, equivalent to 127 grams of rice per page. It was found that in 1008, the price of wheat in Kaizhou, present-day's Humadian, Henan, and other places was half that of polished rice, so the price per page was 254 grams of wheat. The book cost 50 kilograms of wheat per silver coin, and 100 copper coins per silver coin, which translates to 0.5 copper coins per page. This is the selling price, not the cost. The estimated profit from selling the collected works of Du Guangbu for 1,000 yen was 200 to 300 yen. Therefore, the cost of the book was 0.4 copper coins per page. At the time, a page was one side. Chapter 80 How to Boil Water. It was time to boil the water. Frederick toiled in his study for an incalculable amount of time, only to discover that many prerequisites remained unresolved. First, to boil the water, he needed to determine the steam pressure. Did he have a pressure gauge? Fortunately, he was familiar with pressure gauges in his previous life, so he drew a schematic for a burden tube pressure gauge and gave it to Amit to solve. However, the difficulties were just beginning. Frederick chose a steam engine with a power of 20 to 30 horsepower as his target, taking a median of 25 horsepower. The current power of the magic reciprocating engine was between 5 and 10 horsepower, and a higher power engine was needed to compete with it. Practice has shown that this power is sufficient for most current machines. A higher power engine would require a higher speed, which would make heat dissipation more difficult, requiring more energy for cooling and lowering overall efficiency. Therefore, Frederick decided to focus on the low power range for the magic reciprocating engine while moving towards a higher power steam engine. Having determined the output power, he began calculations. Based on steam engine structure and physics, the theoretical output power formula is P equals 2xnxlx/4, xp, 75x60, where P is output power in horsepower, N is engine speed in revolutions per minute, L is piston stroke in meters, D is piston diameter in centimeters, and P is steam pressure in kilograms per centimeter. The formula clearly shows that to reduce the size of a steam engine, the steam pressure must be increased. After figuring out the piston diameter and stroke based on intuition, the next step was to determine the rotational speed. I figured the piston linear velocity V for a single-cylinder steam engine was 2 to 3 meters per second, yielding the formula, N equals 60 V/2L revolutions per minute. From there, the boiler's steam pressure could be calculated, which needed to be slightly higher than the engine's operating pressure. Frederick's head was about to explode. He had no experience with steam boiler design and only a general understanding of boiler structure. He had never heard of the flow rate and pressure drop methods used in steam piping selection. He could only continue to use his intuition to build it first, then gradually refine it. Frederick chose to use magical energy without hesitation for the boiler's power source, a decision he had reached after much deliberation. Coal mining was still very backward back then, and the smelter already consumed all of Wesson territory's imports. There simply wasn't enough coal to boil water. Using magic crystals was different. Their greatest advantage was that they could draw on magical elements from nature to power themselves, generating no emissions and being environmentally friendly and pollution-free. The heating magic circle could be completely submerged in water, and the heat it emitted was completely absorbed by the surrounding water, unlike coal-fired systems where much heat remained unused in the flue gases. Using magical energy also offered the advantage of easier control over the heat. The magic circuit in the heating magic circle could be connected to pressure gauge and water level gauge, allowing for high heat if pressure wasn't sufficient, low heat if pressure was too high, and heat preservation if pressure was normal. If the water level was insufficient, the valves would automatically close to prevent the boiler from drying out. Then, Frederick encountered another problem. He had to start from scratch with the steam and water valves. With the arrow already on the string, he couldn't afford to dwell on other matters. He abandoned his pursuit of perfection and, instead, invented the thread rolling, tapping, and thread rolling machines used to make screws and nuts. He copied the screw diameter, original triangle height, and thread pitch from his previous life, and would conduct destructive tests to test their performance limits. Fortunately, he had worked in installation engineering for a while and was familiar with these machines. With these machines, making a stop valve should be a piece of cake, and other valves would be no problem. To prevent the steam engine from becoming a self-destructing truck, the boiler and cylinder needed to be sufficiently strong, requiring sufficient wall thickness without wasting material. This required extensive experimental data, then incorporating material mechanics to derive the relevant formulas. Without theoretical guidance, producing a higher-powered steam engine would require a complete overhaul. Frederick spent countless days and nights calculating before finally determining the necessary data. This magical steam engine had a cylinder diameter of 140 mm, a piston stroke of 230 mm, and a rotational speed of 300 revolutions per minute. Taking into account various energy losses, achieving 25 horsepower would require steam pressure exceeding 10 atmospheres. Meanwhile, the glass artisan summoned by Archbishop Victor arrived. Frederick spent a day selecting a leader from among the artisans to oversee the construction of the glass workshop. He also approved reforms to various departments within Wessenland and began designing the various components and finalizing the manufacturing process. The boiler was primarily made of rolled steel plates, making welding simple. A skilled fire mage from the University of Wessenberg was hired to handle the work. The hemispherical sections at each end were forged from steel plates in a mold. Since the boiler's ends needed frequent opening to inspect the magic circles, flanges were conveniently installed, and lead seals were used. After the cylinder body was cast, it was forged in the upper mold to remove imperfections such as air holes. The exterior was then machined on a lathe, and the interior was fine-tuned using a boring mill. The piston is cast directly, then lathe machined for the outer shape, internal threaded holes, and grooves for the sealing rings. Its diameter is 1 mm smaller than the cylinder. While the sealing ring is simple to manufacture, it demands high material properties. It must not be too hard to damage the cylinder, and its elasticity must be neither too strong nor too weak. This is a task left to professionals. The piston and rod are connected by threads in the piston's inner bore and at one end of the rod. Nuts are clamped on both sides, and lead seals are cast and secured to prevent loosening. A sliding valve controls the flow of steam into and out of the cylinder. Its movement is controlled by a connecting rod, allowing steam to enter the cylinder from either side of the piston, propelling its reciprocating motion, while exhaust gases are discharged through the open passages. This component requires long-term reciprocating motion, requiring tight sealing and making frequent replacement difficult. Therefore, the contact surfaces are made of copper. Like the boiler, the cylinder's ends are connected by flanges and lead sealing rings, but the piston rod passes through one end, requiring a gland to prevent steam leakage during piston rod movement. There weren't many options for filler. He called BASF for a long consultation, ultimately settling on a slime-like soft rubber ring with additives that was heat-resistant and wear-resistant. The rest was simple: the crosshead, main connecting rod, flywheel, and crankshaft used in the magic reciprocating engine could all be directly used in the steam engine. With the main components designed, the next step was the design of the piping and various accessories. First, he considered the valve that controlled the boiler's supply of steam to the steam engine. He designed a stop valve inside the drum, controlled by magical muscle. It locked the pipe like a finger when not in use, and released when it started, though he wasn't sure if it would work. Next, the top safety valve, similar to the exhaust valve in a pressure cooker, normally blocked by gravity and pushed open to release the air when the pressure reached a dangerous level. There was also a side safety valve, below the lowest water level, plugged with lead. The magic circuit for the heating magic circle passed through it. When the water level dropped below the lead, continued heating in the boiler melted the lead, releasing the steam and shutting off the magic circuit. Wheels were also crucial, otherwise, no one would be able to lift such a large object. Finally, all these things were put together, with a boiler placed horizontally at the bottom, the steam engine installed on top, and a chimney to blow out the steam. And that was it, a magical pot-carrying machine was born. At this point, Frederick couldn't help but wonder, since this thing already has wheels, why not just connect the wheels directly to the flywheel, add a steering gear to the front wheels, and a cab at the back, and it would be a tractor. Chapter 81 Exploding a Boiler. A rain, at the end of May, washed clean the green leaves from the mountain forests. Birds flutter their wings high in the fresh air. Beneath the rainbow, a 1-ton boiler, with a resounding roar, temporarily escaped the constraints of gravity. With a resounding bang, the boiler flew over the hill over 200 meters, landing in a mountain stream, startling rabbits drinking water in the distance and sending them scattering. A kilometer away, on a hilltop, a group of men split into two groups, one heading for the site where the boiler had been initially fired, and the other for the site where the boiler had landed. Frederick frowned, speechless with these men. He had merely mentioned concerns about the boiler exploding from excessive pressure, and then the group began destructive testing. Ahmed had even manufactured several specially designed pressure gauges. These were connected to the boiler via long pipes. The needle on the dial moved according to the pressure, while a toothpick also moved the needle on the other dial opposite. When the boiler's pressure drops or the boiler and its pressure gauge are blown away, the pointer on the second dial will remain at the point where the boiler's pressure is at its highest. This is the fifth boiler to explode, and the plan calls for 5 more explosions to obtain sufficient data. The boiler in question was a finished product, designed to be 2.5 meters long, 1.2 meters in diameter, and 12 millimeters thick. Made of slightly reinforced elemental steel, it weighs approximately 1.1 tons, and with the appropriate amount of water, it weighs approximately 3.3 tons. Today, the boiler only needs to be installed with the instrumentation, heating magic circle, and control system, but the air outlet and safety valve are blocked. My heart is bleeding, Frederick sighed. These are all gold coins. Ahmed, standing beside him, smiled, feeling rather cheerful since he wasn't spending his own money. Frederick continued, Alice, a steam engine will cost nearly 1,000 florins to build. Who can afford it? Ahmed and his team estimated the cost of the steam engine, and the price shocked Frederick. This meant that nobles below the rank of baron would have no hope of buying one. That's okay, said All Might, a knowledgeable man. Others can't afford it, but our Lord Paladin can't afford it, can't he? Your large panes of glass are so smooth and flat, even the king sent someone to buy them. Frederick curled his lips. He had created the inexpensive Holy Codex and donated the Maltos formula. The Church of Light gave him the title of Paladin and an enchanted saber, and that was it. Seeing his expression, All Might asked curiously, are you dissatisfied with the Church of Light? Frederick didn't deny it. A strange smile crossed All Might's face. What's wrong? Frederick was a little surprised to see him laughing like that. Is there something I don't know? Ogilvy smiled and replied, you'll know when you come of age. Then he changed the subject. The church is quite rich. What do you think about having them buy the kind of tractors you mentioned and rent them to farmers? Not very good. Frederick shook his head. Nowadays, there are still many farms with strip fields. Once the tractor goes in, it plows the land of 2 families, and the ridges in the middle are gone. How to account for it? The landowners may rent it. Their common land is a large piece, which is convenient to use. If tractors are really to be promoted, the land must be redistributed between landlords and tenants, at least so that the land can be divided into pieces like in my territory. In the future, maybe a village's fields will only be 4 or 5 pieces divided according to crop rotation. Others can't afford the steam engine, so we use it internally. How long do you estimate it will take to complete all the work after the boiler experiment is successful? Ogilvy estimated in his mind and said, it will take another month to produce the first machine. If we want to mass produce it, I think it will be next year. Frederick thought for a moment and asked, is the current steel production sufficient? Ahmed is now equivalent to the director of the Industrial Bureau of Wesson County. He is very familiar with this matter and replied, "The smelter will be able to officially start production next month. We have stockpiled enough raw materials and fuel, and skilled workers are in place. Apprentices will learn while working." Now the construction workers who are building the smelter have begun to be transferred to the city of Langner in the south. "A cement plant will be built there according to your plan." Frederick nodded slightly, then said, "Currently, steam engines are of great use in machine production. We can start planning to replace other power sources now. The magic reciprocating engines that are eliminated in the future will be sold to the villages." Ahmed was a little depressed. He thought that his magic reciprocating engine could make more money, but he didn't expect a more powerful steam engine to appear. He replied, "Replacing the two machines isn't a big deal. They both essentially rely on reciprocating motion, so there's little that needs to be modified." Frederick suddenly said, "Now that the steam engine is ready, it's time to move into the textile industry, arrange for someone to find the best weavers in the territory, and in the fall, we'll discuss how to use the steam engine for spinning and weaving." Ahmed immediately agreed. Frederick took a deep breath of the fresh mountaintop air, relaxing himself. With the business expanding, things began to pile up. He had previously mentioned the Edelweiss Library to the Grand Duke of Mainz, and the Grand Duke had taken the initiative to help him find an architect who is currently studying the layout of the Pentagon. The first round of military recruitment had concluded, and the recruits were currently undergoing physical training and traditional pike formation drills, which he hadn't yet visited. And so on. Frederick and Ahmed chatted for a while about matters in the territory. The student team, led by Schmidt, had compiled the data from today's experiment and returned to report. "Principal, Professor Almut," Schmidt said, holding a piece of paper, "the results are out." Almut was very satisfied with Schmidt. When he saw someone making money, he didn't ask the principal for ideas, but looked for work everywhere. He was discovered by the principal at the paper mill. Finally, he was promised a knighthood for his work on the double-sided printing press, so Almut gave him the work on the steam engine. After Frederick nodded, Schmidt looked at the data on the paper and said, "When the boiler exploded today, the internal pressure reached about 25 atmospheres. Judging from the state of the boiler and the scene, the screws of the top plate collapsed because they could not withstand the pressure. The explosion scene was huge. The surrounding wooden stakes were blown away, chickens and ducks were shocked to death, and the flying top plate smashed a fox in a tree." Frederick nodded, thoughtfully said, "The normal operating pressure of this boiler is 12 atmospheres, and the maximum pressure is 15 atmospheres. The safety margin of 10 atmospheres is enough. Remember to carry the boiler back and melt it again. I don't have that much money to make new materials." Schmidt showed a bright smile on his face, as long as he didn't have to pay for it. Frederick glared at him fiercely, then asked, "How's the steam engine going?" Schmidt's face darkened, and he said cautiously, "There's still a gap between the sealing rings on the cylinder and piston. Water seeped in during the water filling test." Frederick figured there was nothing he could do about it, so he said, "Let it leak. Just keep it within an acceptable range. First, fix the problem, then fix it." Schmidt breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Principal, I have two ideas. Could a safety valve be controlled by a spring? If it's the way it is now, it's fine if it's level, but if it's tilted, it will reduce the operating pressure. Second, the boiler accessories. Can their safety strength be set between the safety valve's operating pressure and the boiler's ultimate pressure, acting as a secondary safety valve and also as a warning before an explosion?" Frederick thought for a moment, then said, "You decide on these. It's up to you from now on. I have high hopes for you." He could only come up with so much. The rest was up to the scholars to continue their research and develop it through study. Schmidt immediately exclaimed happily, "Thank you, President. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels." Chapter 82, The Showdown Between the Peaks. On the day the sixth boiler exploded, Psyche, Richardnell, and Manuel arrived in Wessenland with a large fleet. Frederick immediately rushed to the town of Treuchtlingen and arrived at the docks. It was bustling as usual, though many more people in robes were looking around curiously. He found Psyche and Richardnell on a boat. "Thank you for your hard work," he said, smiling as he boarded. "Did you have a good trip? Why don't you go back and rest?" "Hey, Sister Psyche, your new dress is so beautiful. Psyche was wearing traditional Constantine clothing, a long-sleeved white cotton dress, delicately embroidered only at the cuffs, below the neckline, and along the hem with bright yellow thread. Over the dress was a blue robe with a white embroidery band around the edges. Around her waist was a leather belt studded with crystals. Beautiful, isn't it? She said proudly. I ordered it a long time ago, but I came here before I could pick it up. This is the perfect time to pick it up. Frederick nodded and said, yes, it's beautiful. Hurry up and get off the boat. I've asked the kitchen to prepare a banquet. Richardner, standing next to him, said gloomily, hey, why don't you compliment my dress? Frederick was deliberately leaving him alone. Today, the swordmaster was also wearing traditional Constantine clothing. The embroidery on his white silk robe was far superior to that on Psyche's dress, both in terms of material and craftsmanship. Most importantly, he was wearing a purple cape embroidered with the gold thread, which was a big problem. While purple clothing was affordable for the wealthy, it was different in Constantine. Purple was a symbol of imperial power. Anyone outside the royal family who wanted to wear purple clothing would either be rewarded or rebel and become emperor themselves. Frederick tilted his head and asked, Master, did you rob the emperor's wardrobe? Psyche burst out laughing, and Richard's expression deepened. Finally, he angrily said, I was going to give you this cloak on your wedding day, but now I won't. Frederick scratched his head and asked sheepishly, Master, how did you get this cloak? I robbed it, Richard replied unhappily. Frederick feigned astonishment, then asked with starry eyes, I bet this cloak is a valuable trophy or prize. Richard, now elated, said modestly, it's nothing. I just killed a haha magic god, and that idiot emperor was so scared that he gave it to me. Frederick's face was genuinely surprised, and then he stamped his foot in regret. Frederick knew Richardner was formidable, but he'd never seen the sword saint at full strength. After all, no one here, save Psyche, was his match. Those who came to challenge him had already fallen before he could even use his full strength. He didn't miss out on fishing. This was a life and death battle between two supreme masters, the sword saint and the god of magic. It was bound to be spectacular and brilliant. It didn't matter if the steam engine was delayed. If he missed this kind of battle, he might never have another chance. Master, Frederick said coquettishly, can you tell me about that battle? Richardner continued to brag, oh, there's nothing much to say. It's just a magic god. It was solved with a flick of the finger. Frederick continued to act cute and coquettish, pulling on his sleeve and shaking it continuously, saying cutely, Master, what did you say? It's nothing. Richardner folded his hands over his chest and looked up at the blue sky. We just arrived in Constantinople that day. That Phocos was kind enough to give me face and invited us to dinner in the palace. He was able to win this time. I don't know where he recruited a young magic god. He's less than 40 years old, a very talented person. He just entered this field in the past 2 years. It's rare for him to reach this point at his age. He's too arrogant, but that's nothing. I used to be like that too, but his mistake was that he wanted to use me as a stepping stone. Frederick immediately asked excitedly, did he challenge you? Richardner smiled, his face full of sarcasm, and continued, if he had challenged me properly, he might have survived, but he actually challenged me at the banquet, arguing with me about whether magic or swords were faster within 7 steps. Psyche chimed in, he's well qualified to say that. His speed casting technique is truly world-class. You could learn from him. Frederick gaped in surprise and asked nervously, Master, are you okay? In a battle fought by the top powers, milliseconds matter. Whoever can seize a split second of opportunity stands victorious. A master of speed casting possesses a tremendous advantage. Richardner boasted, I'm not even a hair hurt. Frederick's eyes instantly filled with admiration, and he anxiously asked, Master, tell me how you did it. Richardner stood there complacently, silent, trying to keep him in suspense. After Frederick's repeated requests, the swordmaster finally said, that fool said something he shouldn't have said, and in a fit of rage, I shot him in the head. Then, Richardner pulled an oversized revolver from his waistband, gestured triumphantly, and posed with it close to his face, his expression and posture reminiscent of the one Shogun god. This revolver was significantly larger than the military's, with a 15mm caliber and a larger and longer cylinder. The silver barrel was embellished with gold patterns. Diesel made it for me, he said proudly. They've specially reinforced a jet tank, making it much more powerful. The force is immense, and it's hard to control. Frederick was petrified. It took him a while to come to his senses, wanting to complain but not knowing where to begin. Richardal smiled and said, "Only people like us could do this." He sensed something was amiss and cast a magic shield, but it was my enchantment on the projectile that pierced the incomplete shield. Frederick took a deep breath, calming himself. "Did Focus give you any trouble?" he asked, a question that felt silly the moment he asked it. He was wearing the purple cloak, so he was definitely not troubled. Richardal said seriously, "I regret not bringing you along. You should learn from Focus's behavior. Remember, those who rise to power through force or conspiracy shouldn't be underestimated. They all have their own strengths. Focus knows how to win people over. How could he possibly give me a hard time? He even keeps trying to get me to serve him, offering me positions, territories, and wealth. He sends him 20 or 30 beautiful women a day," Psyche explained. "They're all well-educated and well-mannered beauties, and he accepts them all." Frederick's mouth twitched. But that was perfectly normal. Winning people over is all about money, sex, and power. As a man, it's normal to accept them. Richardal touched Frederick's head and said with a smile, "Those are the families of losers. If I didn't accept them, they would either be sold as slaves or sent to the military camp to be abused. I brought them all back to you." Frederick blinked. "What's the situation with bringing them all back to me?" Chapter 83, Windfall. Frederick walked over to the side of the ship and peered over. Sure enough, he noticed that 300 or 400 women looked different from the others around them. Many of them had come to stay with family members, and upon disembarking, they were clearly relieved to have reached their destination. Many burst into tears upon meeting their families who had come with the news. The women, young and old, stood there blankly, their eyes expressionless, like wooden statues. "Let's send them to the University of Wessenland first," Frederick frowned helplessly. "There are more people from Constantia there, so they'll have easier access." The sheer number of people frightened him. If it were just 20 or 30, it would be easy, but arranging hundreds would be a headache. It also indirectly reflected Richardner's status in the underworld. And then, Richardner asked, "I promised them I'd give them a new life here." Frederick thought for a moment, unable to come up with a good idea. He said, "I don't know what to do with them right now. For now, let's have them learn the local language and writing. They'll be given priority when jobs become available." Richardner nodded, believing it was the only option. Psyche continued, "Many people took advantage of the situation to escape here, many of them craftsmen. Focus's taxes in the city are high, and those who can escape are seizing the opportunity." Frederick said, "I'll have the guild take care of them." He then called down to Taro, asking her to send someone back to Wessenland to fetch help. "Anything else?" Frederick asked. Richardal pointed to the cabin below, and everyone entered. "Did you rob the palace?" Frederick asked the two men in front of him, surprised. Before him lay an open iron chest, just over half a meter long, wide, and high. Inside was a single item, gold bars. The royal family of the Confederation of the Rhine, occupying both sides of the Rhine and the vast plain to the north, and possessing mineral wealth, earned an annual income of approximately 30,000 florins. The Archduke of Mainz's territory was mountainous, but his family owned mines, bringing his family's annual income to between 10,000 and 20,000 florins. The fiefdoms of the nobles of the Confederation of the Rhine were smaller than those of other lands. A count with a well-developed territories generally earned between 1,000 and several thousand florins annually, depending on the size of the territories, while a baron's income was between 300 and 400 florins. The gold bars in the box might not seem like much, but they actually weighed over a ton, equivalent to 10 years' worth of revenue for the Confederation of the Rhine royal family. Psyche said calmly, "Someone had them in the basement of a library for 200 or 300 years. Seeing no one wanted them, I picked them up." Frederick blinked and asked cautiously, "Are there any more?" Psyche rolled her eyes and said, "You thought they were just wildflowers or weeds by the roadside?" Frederick nodded, thinking that made sense. "The rest is silver," Psyche said, pointing to several nearby boxes. Frederick's eyes widened. That was quite a lot of silver. This windfall meant a lot to him. It could build hundreds of steam engines. "What a hassle," he said, "a happy dilemma. All this gold and silver needs to be minted into coins before it can be used." "How many silver coins will that cost?" Richardal said calmly. "Then mint your own coins. Just follow the coinage laws of the Confederation of the Rhine." Frederick was immediately tempted. The Confederation of the Rhine was originally formed by the remnants of the defeated Second Prussian Empire. To win over the people, The king at the time granted the nobles the right to mint coins, but he also stipulated the precious metal content, weight, and design on one side of the florin, cruse, and copper coin. While the right to mint coin seemed desirable, not everyone had a mine. Ultimately, only the royal families and nobles with mines benefited. To mint coins, one had to contact a bank to issue currency. Banks now primarily focused on currency exchange, with lending being secondary, and deposits charged a storage fee. There were no banks in Wesson County, and currency exchange relied on professional merchants in the market. Running a bank was a technical undertaking, even more specialized than running a university, requiring specialized personnel. Currently, the most recognized were the bankers of the coastal regions of Sardinia and their familial teams. These were the mercenaries of the financial industry, professional and loyal. Any who deliberately harmed or betrayed their employers would be executed by the guild's hired professionals, thus safeguarding the credibility and interests of the entire group. Frederick considered his lack of specialized personnel, realizing he could only trust the experts in Sardinia. Katie knew Sardinia well, so he would need her help. Frederick made a decision: have the two leaders guard the gold and silver until nightfall before transporting them back to the castle. While traveling at night was inconvenient, the leaders had a greater advantage in the darkness, making any potential attackers more visible. Hiding in the bushes during the day was a common occurrence, but in the middle of the night, if you were attacked, no one would defend you. Frederick disembarked to explore other areas, but upon leaving the cabin, Manuel summoned him to court to retrieve the victim. The man to be rescued was a thin, petite old man. Manuel had initially approached Frederick, saying he'd just snatched the dock clerk's notebook out of curiosity. The young man, however, was a bit stubborn and called the sheriff. Unexpectedly, upon arriving at the courthouse, the old man was charged with a new crime: robbery. "Have you had enough?" Manuel roared, startling everyone in the courtroom. He rolled up his sleeves and threatened to hit the man, and then a fight ensued. The courthouse staff were accustomed to such incidents. In the past, when local young men were caught stealing, they often received a beating and scolding after their families were brought in. The judge whispered to Frederick, "Sir, would you like to place a bet?" Frederick replied coldly, "I hate gambling, be careful. If someone catches you gambling and asks you to bend the law, haha." The judge immediately broke out in a cold sweat and began to express his loyalty. Frederick didn't look at him again, his attention focused on Manuel and the old man. Manuel's punches were methodical, clearly well-trained, but the old man, holding a freshly printed copy of the Wesson County Code in his right hand, effortlessly blocked the blows with his left. Frederick pinched his chin, noticing a resemblance between Manuel and the old man. "Ouch! You broke the rules." The old man rubbed his butt, a look of frustration on his face. Manuel had just kicked him out of the blue. Manuel ignored him and angrily said to Frederick, "Principal, I won't bother you. Let him stay in jail." Frederick smiled and said, "It's not a big deal. Just a fine." Manuel immediately pulled a purple silk purse from his waist bag and handed it to the judge, saying, "Here you go, my money." The old man rushed over. Manuel pointed to Frederick and said, "This is our principal." He then gave the principal a secret look. The old man paused, then turned to look at Frederick. His demeanor suddenly shifted, transforming into that of a sage. "Not bad, not bad, very good," he said, his gaze at Frederick like a seasoned gourmet looking at a delicacy. "I, Celsus, am the wisest man on this coast. I have trained countless emperors, kings, and great scholars. Even a simpleton like Manuel can be made into a sage. You appear to be incredibly intelligent and insightful. Are you interested in becoming my disciple?" Frederick asked sweetly. "Excuse me, do you know how to make metal from ore using electric current?" Celsus looked puzzled. "Would smelting metal simply require fire?" Seeing he didn't respond, Frederick, in a charming way, asked, "Excuse me, do you know how to calculate axial forces, shear forces, bending moments, and torques in building structures?" Celsus remained bewildered, not understanding. Frederick made another cute face and asked, "So, do you know how to artificially inseminate reptiles?" Celsus remained perpetually bewildered. What was this all about? Frederick shrugged and said regretfully, "You don't know anything, so forget it." Celsus's face flushed and paled with anger. He snorted loudly, turned and left, then returned. He had no money and was unfamiliar with the place, so he couldn't leave. Manuel said to Frederick, "This old man is still useful. Just find him a job." Celsus nodded immediately and said, "Yes, yes, yes," Any job you have here that's easy and pays well? Give it to me. Frederick smiled and said, no rush now. Let's get settled first. Let Manuel arrange the job. Manuel replied immediately, okay, I'll take him to work now. Then he turned to Celsius and said fiercely, hurry and move all those books down and take them back to the school. Chapter 84 Coinage and Spreading of Coins. The vault beneath the castle, empty for a while, finally had gold stored there again, freed from its fate of being used to grow mushrooms. Frederick was so delighted that he dreamed of counting money that night, counting until he woke up naturally. But money needs to be used, it wouldn't create value if it sat in a vault. After 2 days of thought, Frederick finally figured out how to spend it. The first step was to open a bank. A banker, Katie pondered over breakfast. I'm close to a lady from the Alvarado family. I painted her wedding portrait. I'll write to her and ask her to recommend someone suitable. The Alvarado family, Frederick asked, putting down his glass of milk. How professional are they? As soon as he asked, he realized he'd asked the wrong question. Katie, Richard, and Psyche all looked at him like he was stupid, as if he'd asked Bill Gates if he knew how to use a computer. Frederick responded with a I'm sorry, country bumpkin expression. Katie explained, the Alvarado family's bank is the largest bank in the southern part of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Apart from the head of the family who is engaged in politics, the side branches are all engaged in banking work, and they have created a banking network around the inland sea by setting up banks in various places through side branches. Although their family is powerful, they have always put the interests of their employers first, and they are even willing to make enemies with other relatives. After hearing this, Frederick thought about it and found that he had no better choice. Choosing an agent is like going into a restaurant. You go into the restaurant with the most people on the street. Finally, he said, then find them. Katie asked him, what kind of people do you want to find? Frederick replied, someone who is good at lending and making money with money. Katie said she understood and would write a letter to her friend before heading to the paper-making workshop. Next, it was time to design the coin designs. Among the currently circulating currencies, the florin had only one denomination, the crus had denominations of 1 and 10, and the copper coins had denominations of 1, 5, 10, and 50. Frederick decided to add some new denominations, but the florin remained unchanged. Since the gold coins were too large to make change, the crus could be set in denominations of 1, 2, 5, and 10, while the copper coins would have denominations of 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, and 50. Because the obverse of the Confederation of the Rhine currency featured the king's portrait, the personalized designs of each territory could only appear on the reverse. Frederick ultimately decided against fancy designs, simply requiring the coin's value to be instantly recognizable, and so he drew inspiration from mahjong tiles. The florin's design would be the small chicken, a white stork, a common sight in Wessenland and elsewhere, and a popular auspicious bird. The 1, 2, and 5 denominations of crus and copper coins were marked with a corresponding number of bars. The 10, 20, and 50 denominations were marked with multiples of 10. There was no definitive definition of the bars. With the current coinage resolution, it was impossible to achieve a high degree of precision, so we'll just take whatever everyone said. Also, Wesson was marked above the design, and the year of production below. There was no need to find a production location, the castle's blacksmith shop would do. It was the Wesson family's arsenal, and its craftsmen were trustworthy. However, Frederick still wanted to come up with some new ideas. Current coins were made by weighing a certain weight of metal and then striking it with a mold. The edges were irregular, so some people would chip off the edges, sometimes even chipping off a small piece of the coin, causing a lot of trouble. Frederick called on Amit to discuss the minting machine. I'm going to give the coin a circle of fine teeth, he said, pointing to his own drawing. If someone chipped the edge, it would be visible. Almut understood what he meant and said seriously, it's no problem to do it, but first of all, you have to rule out cutting it out like making gears. Frederick smiled and said, of course not, that would be too time-consuming. I plan to use a stamping die, and reserve space for fine teeth on the edge of the die. Almut thought for a moment and said, no problem, our punch presses are powerful enough now to press out these fine teeth, and the die can be made of reinforced metal. Frederick nodded and asked him to try to modify a few of the existing punch presses first. Almut put away the pattern on the back, and then a dog-legged smile appeared on his face. Principal, he said, you are rich now, so you should buy more machines, right? Frederick laughed and joked, you are going to be a father, and you are starting to save money for your children, Right, Almut said with a smile, when the principal becomes a father in the future, you will understand what I think. Frederick smiled, then his expression became serious, and he said, I made a fortune recently, but I won't keep the money. I'm going to spend it. Our industry in Wesson County needs to develop. After the smelter is put into production, our steel production will increase significantly, but we can't make much money just by selling raw materials. According to my initial plan, we want to develop the metal manufacturing industry, making steel into nails, wire, screws, nuts, locks, hinges, latches, springs, screwdrivers, pliers, hammers, saws and other things will make more money than simply selling raw materials. I can't do so much by myself, and you two can't take care of it either, so I plan for the two of us to control the raw materials and the machines to produce those things. And let other people make money on the trivial things. Amit immediately understood what he meant and confirmed with him, just like BASF, it only controls the raw materials and doesn't care what others do with them after buying them. Yes. Frederick nodded. I plan to use that money to lend to those who want to make money but lack the capital. You can focus on machines powered by steam engines and magic reciprocating engines to produce various goods, and then hold an exhibition and sales event. I will provide special loans to those who are interested in purchasing but lack the capital. This money can only be used to purchase these machines, which is like transferring money from one pocket to the other, and also incurs interest and taxes. I also plan to build an industrial park outside the city, with some brick and wood factories, and rent them to those who can't afford to build factories. After hearing this, All Might pondered and asked, in other words, if someone wants to open their own workshop, they don't need to prepare too much capital. They can rent a factory and buy the machines with a loan. All they need is money for raw materials, rent, and workers. Frederick nodded. All Might frowned and asked, what if that person can't make money and can't repay the loan for the machines? Frederick replied, that's simple. Just don't ship the machines purchased with a loan out of Wesson County. When the time comes, paint the machines of customers who buy with loans and customers who pay in full different colors, or put a couple of nails in unimportant parts, so that the people at the customs and checkpoints can recognize them at a glance. Amit thought this was also a good idea. As long as the machines were still there, they could just take them back if they couldn't pay back the money. This is a good idea, he said. When necessary, you don't even need to pay. You can just issue a note to ship the goods, and settle the bill at the end of the year. Frederick also said, I think so too. I'm going to open a bank now. When the time comes, everyone can open an account in the bank. There is no need to pay custody fees for deposits. For large transactions, professional bills can be used to transfer money directly to the account, and a small handling fee can be charged. In this way, you don't have to carry money around. Amit said with a smile, this is indeed convenient. It would be great if we could do the same to pay the workers. If there are too many people, the wages have to be transported by car. Frederick pinched his chin and said, that's not impossible. I can give you a kind of voucher with the same denomination as currency. When the time comes, you can give it to the workers, and the workers can take it to the bank to exchange it for currency or deposit it into their own accounts. Amit smiled and shook his head and said, forget it. Some people have done this before, but too many vouchers were issued and they couldn't be exchanged for money. In the end, they all became useless parchment. Frederick just smiled and didn't say anything more about it. Paper money was still too early for this era. The two talked about the loan to buy the machine for a while, and Amit sighed again. I thought the principal's estate was occupied by the university, and he would build a new mansion when he had money. Everyone knows that castles are not comfortable to live in. Rich nobles usually live in luxurious mansions and only return to the castle for important ceremonies and wars. The Wesson family has two manors close to the castle. The one by the lake was given to the University of Wessenberg, and the other is now a seed breeding base and chicken and duck seedling wholesale center, which is too noisy. Frederick curled his lips slightly and said, a new mansion must be built, but I want to build a peach blossom stone-style mansion. Oh, Amit was shocked. Really? Everyone now knew that Frederick had brought back a wealth of crops from the distant Teohuashi region in the east through a pagan merchant, even wheat ready for planting in spring. Suddenly, everyone was filled with curiosity about this country, which had previously existed only on parchment. So, when he now announced his intention to build a Teohuashi-style mansion, Amit wasn't surprised. He even felt a bit of anticipation. In his previous life, Frederick had taken a Chinese garden course as a student and had some understanding of garden architecture. Later, while working He had participated in a garden-style resort project. Although the climate and flora differed between the two regions, it was still possible to create a highly similar replica based on local conditions. However, this person pinched his chin and said, "The mansions of the wealthy in Teohuashi won't be built quickly, they're too elaborate. But the residential buildings can be used to house the workers in the industrial park," Amit said with a hint of envy. "Those workers are so lucky." Many years later, a young female navigator from the east was chasing someone in a brick and concrete tube-shaped building complex next to the industrial park. Chapter 85 New Tradition. This year's summer arrived faster than usual. After a heavy rain in late May, the weather suddenly became scorching hot. It was the day for the regular meeting of all departments in Wesson territory. Frederick was in a trance. Not only were the attendees dressed in white shirts and dark trousers, but each also held a thermos. There were significantly more people in the meeting room today than last year. Chief Steward Afu, Administrator Frick, Tax Officer Neuer, Judge Otto, Military Officer Franz, Old Knight, Commerce Officer Janice, Industry Officer Amit, Agriculture Officer Matthias, Undersecretary of Agriculture, in charge of Animal Husbandry, Monifler, Vice President of Wesson University Manuel, and the mayors of Wesson Territory's cities of Wessenberg, Hausen to the northwest, Langner to the south, Lingen to the east, Heim to the southwest, and the city of Oak, which was under preparation. Following the restructuring of various government departments in Wesson Territory, new officials, including veterans who previously held relevant responsibilities, have been appointed to lead relevant departments. For example, veteran Knight Franz has been appointed military officer, and family merchant Janice has been appointed commercial officer. There are also newly appointed scholars like Amit. City mayors have been promoted from the existing cadre system based on their past and last year's disaster relief efforts. Today's meeting focused on ensuring the summer grain harvest and procurement, as well as the issue of football fields encroaching on farmland. These two issues are not a major concern. The summer grain harvest will be the same as in previous years, so there's no need to discuss them further. Grain procurement can still be obtained through Wesson syrup. Although the Church of Light has the formula, it's only used internally for team-building activities and is neither sold nor disclosed to the public. Frederick hadn't anticipated the issue of football fields encroaching on farmland. The final decision was that each city could only build one standard field and a maximum of 5 5-a-side fields. Each town could build a maximum of 3 5-a-side fields, and each village could build a maximum of 1 5-a-side field. Furthermore, it was mandated that town and village football fields be covered with thick tape to serve as drying grounds during busy farming seasons. Frederick then emphasized the importance of collecting this year's summer taxes and announced the upcoming establishment of the Wesson Bank and the issuance of currency. The latter two matters had already spread through Amit, but everyone considered them perfectly normal. After all, with the increasing number of merchants arriving in Wesson territory and the canals opening, the establishment of a bank and its own currency was inevitable. More interested, however, was the appearance of the master's mahogany-style mansion. The meeting ended after Manuel reported on this year's enrollment at the University of Wessenberg. Frederick didn't rest after the meeting. The next day, he began his inspection tour of the territory. He first visited the glass workshop outside the city. A long line of carriages lined the premises, and merchants visiting to buy goods gathered in the steamed bun shop near the gate to Boast. Frederick entered the glass workshop, donning a gas mask, and, led by the factory director, inspected the factory. The professionals within the workshop were now in awe of the master. The glass bubble problem that had plagued the industry for years was solved with just a handful of arsenic and a few stirrings. They had previously been studying how to remove small bubbles, but unexpectedly, they could actually do the opposite. Arsenic creates the large bubbles when the raw glass melts. Stirring the melt allows the large bubbles to absorb the smaller ones, and once all the bubbles disappear, the glass is bubble-free. They were also impressed by the newly built furnace, which burned coal in a central hearth. The flames were then transmitted through a fire channel to 3 surrounding smelting chambers via an automatic bellows, achieving high temperatures while conserving fuel. The method for making glassware was even more surprising. A spoonful of molten glass was poured into a mold, and the upper and lower molds were pressed together. If there was excess material, the edges were trimmed, and a glass bowl, plate, or cup emerged. It was even easier to press half a piece at a time, ultimately creating a narrow-mouthed bottle or jug. This was much simpler than the previous practice of blowing until your cheeks ached. Even more surprising was the glass plate. Traditionally, glass plates were made by blowing the molten glass into a ball, then cutting it open and flattening it. Here, it was simple. A large red steel plate, heated by a magic circle, was poured onto it, allowing the liquid glass to spread out. Once it settled flat like the surface of water, it slowly cooled, and a flat sheet of glass, as large as a door panel, was ready. Besides transparent flat glass, patterned rollers could be used to roll over the glass, creating a transparent, yet patterned glass that obscured the view from the other side. This glass workshop was Frederick's own business. Artisans received dividends based on their position and performance. With a deadline of June, he'd received a double bonus for completing his tasks. He had help with the childcare at the kindergarten, and his wife could earn extra income working in the kitchen or shop. His life was better than his former master's. Frederick toured the workshop until he arrived at another workshop, where another key product was produced, crystal glass. The formula of crystal glass differed from that of ordinary glass primarily in that it contained lead oxide, a commonly used pigment that was readily available. Crystal glass, with its exceptional transparency, clarity, and brilliance, was particularly suited to crafting exquisite, high-end vessels. Its softer nature than ordinary glass made it a prime choice for lens grinding. The lens grinder, rescued from a Sardinian prison, had arrived. He was currently studying the nature of light and awaiting his custom-made tools. The magic reciprocating engine powered the machine with powerful and sustained rotation, unlike the previous leg-driven machine, which suffered from leg cramps. This greatly facilitated lens grinding, and the craftsman believed he would soon be able to produce the lenses Frederick needed. He also promised Frederick to write to him and invite other colleagues to come to Wessenland to make their fortune. Finally, Frederick visited the finance office to review the financial statements and discovered that the flat glass had been purchased by a glass mirror workshop managed by Philip of Mainz. He immediately instructed that the glass be sold to them at a discount. This glass workshop, which now focused on the mid-range market, had a different customer base from the surrounding established glass workshops, earning a substantial profit in emerging markets, providing Frederick with a substantial amount of funds. At this moment, Frederick couldn't help but wonder if equipping his entire army with silver-scale breastplates was not out of the question. The arrival of one person surprised Frederick somewhat. Manuel, he raised his eyebrows. Ordering something for the school, for a moment, Manuel seemed to want to run away. Nothing, he replied hesitantly. Just some glass bottles. Seeing his curiosity, Frederick asked, "What are the bottles for?" Manuel, a worldly wise man, quickly regained his composure and replied, "My wife wants to start a business. We buy milk every morning and bottle it to sell to kindergartens and families with children. You know I'm a necromancer. Although milk spoils easily, I'm planning to order a tanker truck that uses magic to kill the microorganisms inside, so there's no need to worry about it spoiling. I've tried it. If you use magic to kill the microorganisms in the milk right after buying it and again when it's sealed for sale, it can keep for 2 or 3 days without being opened." Frederick said immediately, "That's a good thing. Milk is cheap these days. It's only expensive when processed into cheese. 10 liters of fresh milk cost 9 copper coins. A child drinking 0.25 liters of fresh milk a day would only produce 90 liters a year, costing 81 copper coins. However, the bacteria in this world are quite aggressive, making milk difficult to preserve for long periods of time, a major drawback." Even with labor costs and profit added in by Manuel and his team, the price of a bottle of fresh milk remained affordable for ordinary people. Frederick couldn't help but wonder if expanding the dairy herd might actually allow the children in the territory to have a bottle of milk a day. However, there was a problem. He asked, "Ordinary people in the city rarely drink milk unless they're sick. How do you convince them to give their children milk?" He remembered that his original plan to produce powdered milk had failed due to dietary issues. Manuel didn't answer, instead changing the subject. "Oh, that's nothing. By the way, principal, could you lend me some money? I'm tired from moving out here," he said, patting his waist. Frederick didn't press the milk issue any further, asking, "What are your plans?" Manuel replied proudly, "It's about last year's condensed soup. I noticed that some of the soup, while still edible, changed in flavor after a while. Then I discovered that adding sage or rosemary to the soup didn't cause that problem. Now I've found a recipe that adds rosemary alcohol extract without changing the flavor, so I'm planning to build a workshop specializing in condensed soups, and then try preserving fresh fruits and vegetables." Frederick naturally agreed, but he added, "Write me an application." I'll use it as my first loan application once the bank is established. However, I can lend you some money up front. You can pay me back once the loan is approved." Manuel agreed immediately. Frederick didn't get involved in the bottle-bearing incident and returned to the castle in his carriage. On the way, he opened the small window on the carriage and asked the driver, "Do you have a child who is 5 years old this year?" The driver felt flattered and immediately replied, "Thank you for your concern, sir. She will be 6 soon." Frederick asked again, "Would you like to give her milk?" The driver's income was not low. Driving was a technical job, and he had to help the master block knives when necessary. "Of course I would," the driver replied. "Now everyone is saying that you are so smart because you drink milk every day, sir. We have all seen it. Now the girl in my family has started drinking milk every day too. Several of our families pooled their money and went to the manor early in the morning to buy it for her. The people at the manor boil the milk early in the morning and put it in bottles. They cover the bottles and keep them until noon. No problem. I don't ask her to be very smart, just that she won't be cheated in the future." Frederick was stunned. Did he feel like he was leading the trend and changing the tradition? Chapter 86 Harvest. Unnoticed, the rumor that fresh milk was a smart drug spread throughout Wesson territory. Other claims circulated, such as the younger you start drinking it, the more effective it is, and the longer you drink it, the smarter you become. When Frederick visited Chestnut Village again, he heard that diarrhea from drinking fresh milk was actually flushing out a dumb element in your body, and that continuing to drink it until the diarrhea subsided would lead to increased intelligence. This trend led to a slight increase in the price of fresh milk, with 10 liters now fetching 11 copper coins. The price of heifers also rose slightly. Frederick remained silent on the matter, but the claim was not entirely false. Regularly drinking milk could indeed boost children's brain development. Compared to those so-called smart soups made from random flowers and plants, milk was more reliable. However, Frederick hadn't come to Chestnut Village for this reason. He was visiting one of Wesson Territory's agricultural technology promotion centers. The wheat, fortified last year by Matthias, was ready for harvest, so he came to check it out. The tax bureau's staff, estimating summer taxes, had been working for several days. They had fenced off 10 plots of wheat for harvest, and today they were estimating the yield in the vine-covered pavilion next to the threshing floor. Frederick sat beside him, the village chief standing behind him. Outside the pavilion, 3 layers of village chiefs and farmers from surrounding villages were gathered, waiting for the results. Many were still wearing the clothes distributed to disaster victims. The farmers didn't know what new agricultural technology was, but they knew the wheat ears in Chestnut Village's fields were now more numerous, larger, and fuller than the grains in their own fields. The tax bureau clerk was sweating profusely. He had weighed the wheat in the threshing floor 3 times and counted it 8 times himself, but the number still daunted him. After double-checking his calculations, he swallowed, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and carefully reported to Frederick, "Master, the wheat yield here is estimated to be per hectare." He paused, and the people around him held their breath. This season's wheat crop received new fertilizer. Thanks to the magic reciprocating pumps providing ample water, and the seeds magically enhanced, everyone knew the yield would be high, but they didn't know just how much higher. 1,490 kilograms, the tax bureau clerk's words were met with a fluctuating sense of excitement. Previously, wheat yields per hectare in Wesson County fluctuated around 700 kilograms, and good farmland along the Rhine River yielded around 1,100 kilograms on a good day. This year, thanks to the new fertilizer, pumps, and enhanced technology, Lizzie Village's yield doubled, a feat both locals and newcomers found incredibly satisfying. The villagers were beaming with joy. Based on the previous average yield of 700 kilograms of wheat per hectare, after paying 30% of the rent, 490 kilograms would remain. Under this year's new tax policy, some harvests are exempt from tax, while the remaining harvest, after paying 30% of the rent, still leaves 542.5 kilograms of wheat per hectare, a 10% increase over previous years. Now that the yield has reached 1,490 kilograms, the new tax rate means a surplus of 1,154.75 kilograms, nearly 65% higher than the total yield before. Besides wheat, the fields also contain oats and beans planted this spring, which have also seen 3 consecutive increases in yield. If these crops could also double in yield, how could it not be exciting? Frederick's mind was rapidly calculating. The farmer's income was more than double, and he was collecting 60% more rent than in previous years. It might seem like he was losing money, but with increased income, farmers' consumption levels would also rise, boosting industry and commerce within the territory. Next came the competition between the villages. The head of a nearby village asked the head of Lizzie village to buy high-yield seeds. Lizzie village, in accordance with the master's instructions, asked them to exchange wheat at a ratio of 1:1.2. Under the current land system, all land in Wesson County, except for fiefs held by his vassals, belonged to Frederick. The farmers were tenants. From an agricultural perspective, the village chief was his agricultural manager. Excellent performance evaluations offered him the opportunity to become an official in the city, and the most important performance evaluation, of course, was grain production. High-yield wheat was coveted by everyone, but wheat seeds were limited. The scene quickly erupted into commotion, nearly leading to a fight. Frederick slipped away and found Matthias in the conservation forest on the hillside outside the village. Matthias had anticipated this and had gone to the conservation forest to observe the activity and study the herbal medicine undergrowth. Frederick had Taro and the other servants spread a carpet on the flat ground at the top of the hill, applied insect repellent, and prepared for lunch. From there, he could see the chestnut village below and the new village being reclaimed further in the distance. The trees in the farmland had been cut down for money, and now the sheep were grazing the shrubs and weeds, forming a white carpet. Frederick invited Matthias over for food. Today, in addition to Wesson bread, there was also ice cream. After Matthias washed his hands and sat down, Frederick handed him a Wesson bag and said sincerely, "Thank you for everything you've done for Wesson County." Matthias took the Big Mac with a smile on his face and happily began to eat. As he ate, he said, "Principal, our wheat yield can be further improved." "Oh?" Frederick asked in surprise. "How can we do that?" Matthias said, "I've studied the wheat varieties in the territory and found that the biggest problem for the low yield in the past lies in this." "What?" Frederick was shocked. This was something he had never expected. Matthias continued, "The wheat in Wesson County now should be a mixed wheat, that is, two types of wheat are mixed together, and the yield is higher than if they are grown separately, but if this kind of wheat is grown alone, without being mixed, it will degenerate over time." Frederick was very upset. He didn't expect this to be the case. But it made sense. Agricultural knowledge these days relied on accumulation, with little dissemination. Landlords were lucky to know when to plant and harvest crops. Perhaps random crossbreeding yielded high yields one year and then spread them, leading to a gradual decline. Matthias said, "I've sent students to nearby areas with similar climates. They've found a high-yield wheat variety in Mingsing City. It can be planted this autumn. After strengthening and ensuring adequate water and fertilizer, we estimate the yield to reach 1,700 to 1,800 kilograms per hectare." Frederick immediately said, "You'll take care of this. The money will be provided, the people will be provided, and the entire Wesson County will cooperate with you." Frederick now had every confidence in Matthias. If these yields could be maintained for a few years, the Church of Light might even canonize him, or even have him anointed as an angel. "What? You're saying the Holy Scriptures don't mention angels overseeing farming?" "Someone, explain it to him immediately." Chapter 87 New Farming Methods. The negotiations for seed distribution in Lizzie village concluded, and the village chiefs dispersed. Soon, someone came to report the results to Frederick. Frederick shook his head helplessly. "Oh my God," he thought, "distributing quotas through a football match between villages, what a conceit." But after careful consideration, he decided it was a good idea, far better than slashing each other with knives, and approved it. Thus, in the summer of 1025, the Wheat Ear Cup, the first and longest-running cup competition in world football history, began. After a short episode, Frederick asked Matthias, "What do you think the highest wheat yield can be?" Matthias said while eating ice cream, "I heard that the Kingdom of Gaul once had a high yield of 2,000 kilograms per hectare, but it only happened once. The climate, land and wheat seeds in the northern plains there are good. The yield is maintained at around 1,100 kilograms all year round. It's a pity that those wheats are not suitable for us here. I've made an estimate. If there is sufficient fertilizer and the wheat seeds are continuously optimized, it can reach 6,000 kilograms. Frederick nodded slightly. He vaguely remembered that the highest wheat yield record in his hometown under the action of chemical fertilizers was 9 tons per hectare. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said. "First, we'll try to stabilize it at around 2,000 kilograms. Matthias continued, "The Elizabeth potatoes are ready for harvest. I estimate will yield around 6,000 kilograms per hectare. It's high in water, though, so the dry matter is only 20%, but that's not bad. I've done some post-harvest treatments on a few plants, and the yields are even higher, almost double. Frederick's eyes lit up. This was good news, but he said with some concern, I'm worried this oil isn't fertile enough. Chemical fertilizers hadn't been developed yet, and soil fertilizers were definitely not enough. That's certainly a problem, Matthias nodded. But there's good news. I've done experiments to enhance the nodule microorganisms in the roots of milk vetch and peas, increasing their nodules many times over. Really? Frederick was overjoyed. While it wasn't as good as chemical fertilizers, it was a good idea. Matthias said proudly, I did a comparative experiment. I prepared 10 large water tanks, and this oil inside them had been killed with microorganisms using a pressure cooker and manute. The milk vetch and pea seeds were washed with soapy water before planting to ensure that there were no microorganisms on them. The seeds were planted directly in the first water tank. The seeds in the second water tank were mixed with ordinary nodule powder, and the seeds in the third to fifth water tanks were mixed with nodule powder strengthened by magic of different intensities. Finally, the milk vetch and peas in the first water tank had no nodules on their roots and grew very thin. The ones in the second water tank were the same as ordinary ones, and the roots in the next 3 water tanks were more and more towards the back. However, there were also some problems. The peas with the most nodules grew too lushly, and did not bloom when they should have. The milk vetch is better, it grows more lush, but the flowering period is delayed by half a month. Frederick thought about it and understood that this was due to excessive nitrogen fertilizer provided by rhizobia. He said, this technology should be mainly used on milk vetch. At the same time, you can try to add fertilizer after the snow melts to promote flowering. Just use a slightly stronger one on beans. They mainly grow beans. I thought so too. Matthias nodded and said, Principal, I suggest changing the current crop rotation method. Frederick did not answer directly, but asked, tell me how to do it. Matthias put down the empty ice cream bowl, poured himself and the principal a cup of tea, and used the time to sort out his thoughts and organize his language. Here's my plan, he said. Divide the land into main fields and secondary fields. The secondary fields are used to grow vegetables and can also be used to build greenhouses. The main fields are where the main crops are grown. In the main fields, wheat will be planted in the autumn of the first year, and sweet radish will be planted after the harvest. In the second year, after the sweet radish is harvested, milk vetch will be planted. At the end of March on the third year, the milk vetch will be harvested and the soil will be turned over and composted, and then spring wheat will be planted in April. At the end of July, oats will be planted after the wheat is harvested. In the fourth year, soybeans will be planted after the oats are harvested. After the soybeans are harvested in September, milk vetch can be planted again. Elizabeth potatoes will be planted in the fifth year, and milk vetch will continue to be planted after the harvest. In the spring of the sixth year, a season of soybeans will be planted, and in the autumn, wheat will be planted as in the first year. This is a 6-year cycle. The staple food is 2 seasons of wheat and 1 season of Elizabeth potatoes. The oil is 2 seasons of soybeans. The livestock feed is 1 season of oats, 3 seasons of milk vetch and 1 season of sweet radish. If the sweet radish can be used to make sugar, then that is 1 season of sugar crops. Frederick listened and used snacks to arrange the farming order of the crops on a plate. After Matthias finished, he smiled and said, You dare use oats as feed? Many people still rely on it for their livelihoods. Having 3 staple crops in 6 years is better than having 1 in 3 years under the 3-field system. That's a good point. The soybean meal left after soybean oil extraction is a great livestock feed, especially when mixed into bread. With soybean meal and feed crops, we can raise more livestock and get more compost for the farmland. That's a good point. Okay, you'll be responsible for arranging this. Aside from potatoes and spring wheat, the planting techniques for the other crops were already mature, so adjusting the planting order wouldn't be a problem. Planting those 2 crops wouldn't start until a few years later, giving them plenty of time for breeding and familiarization. There was another problem with promoting the new farming method. The land under Wessen's tenants was divided into plots according to the 3-field system, with each household's plot divided into 3 parts. This necessitated the decision of whether to split the plot into 6 parts to ensure a yearly harvest of all crops, or to pool all the land for greater efficiency. Frederick thought for a long time and decided to prioritize stability. Dividing the implementation into 6 parts gradually would increase the margin for error and give the farmers time to adapt. He then asked, "Is there anything special about growing vegetables in the side fields? I'd like to start growing flax, especially oilseed flax." Flax wasn't grown in Wesson County before, as it was available cheaply, but now that printing ink requires linseed oil, it's better to grow some. Matthias nodded and replied, "That's no problem, it's not a difficult task." Frederick, rubbing his chin in thought, said, "Now that I have money, you and Monifleur should discuss importing high-yield crops and livestock from various places." Finally, he smiled and said, "We'll have so much fodder in the future, we can't just eat it all ourselves." Matthias smiled back, his smile brimming with pride. He had studied magic to acquire the skills of civil and military arts and the imperial family, but he had accidentally become biased, thinking that a scholarly life would be his forte. Unexpectedly, his path had taken a turn, and when one path proved blocked, he had chosen another, ultimately achieving unprecedented success. Chapter 88 Arriving at the Military Camp. First, you must diligently study and train, acquiring skills so you can achieve meritorious service. Your uniform is your personal protection, wash it regularly to ensure it's spotless. Second, you must fight bravely. If you're destined to die, you'll survive. If you retreat and disobey military orders, you'll be cast aside and fall into disgrace. Third, you must treat the people with kindness, they rely on the land for food and wages. As long as soldiers and civilians become one family, success will come naturally through mutual support. Fourth, you must not rape other people's women. Who hasn't been born to their parents? You have wives and daughters at home, how can you tolerate humiliation? When Frederick arrived at the barracks early in the morning, the new recruits were gathered in front of the mess hall, chanting his slightly adapted version of the Song of Encouragement, preparing for breakfast. A people's army was overkill for the times. Frederick felt it would be enough for his army to emulate Euphae's army, freeze to death but don't demolish houses, starve to death but don't plunder. To achieve this, they must first be well fed and well paid, and they must also be given a sense of honor. Frederick's visit was sudden, unannounced. From afar, he watched the new recruits, who had been trained for 2.5 months, standing in neat rows and columns, and nodded with satisfaction. Soldiers nowadays have strict formation requirements, and drill training is fundamental. Frederick had simply refined the commands with old France, some mercenaries, and other professionals, and mandated intensified training. Ordinary armies trained once every 3 days, primarily because they ate too little, making daily training unsustainable. This was different. After a full meal and a full day of rest, they trained 3 times a day. The only rest days were Sunday, the 10th of each 10-day period, and half a day in the afternoon on the 5th. It wasn't Frederick's fault, it was the god of light here who took his time, creating the world in 9 days and only resting on the 10th. If he had been more diligent, everyone could have had a few more days of rest. After the new recruits filed into the mess hall, Frederick said to Old Franz, "Come on, let's go in and see what we have for breakfast." Old Franz was originally slated to retire this year to take charge of physical education, but the army needed veterans, so he continued to serve as a military affairs officer while overseeing physical education. His first achievement upon taking office was thwarting a plot by Ahmed and his colleagues, slashing the price of military equipment to a rock bottom, allowing Frederick to finance the new army's uniform program. The new troops were now being trained by Franz the Younger and Richardnal. The former was the leader of the younger generation of Wesson County and would become its future leader. The latter was currently obsessed with a Wesson swordsmanship. Every morning, after teaching Frederick, he would return to the barracks, only appearing every few days to teach students at Wessenberg University. As they approached the cafeteria, they inquired about the smell of the food. Frederick said, "Shall we guess what we're having for breakfast today?" Franz the Elder immediately replied, "Noodles and sausages, and carrot soup." Frederick exclaimed in surprise, "You can even smell carrots in the soup." Franz the Elder pointed to the menu for this month on the cafeteria's outer wall. Frederick's mouth twitched. He had been so preoccupied with checking the new recruits' uniforms, hats, and shoes to see if they had made any shoddy workmanship that he hadn't noticed. He did not enter the cafeteria to disturb everyone's meal, but studied the contents on the wall outside first. According to the menu, today's lunch is steamed bread and pork stewed with sauerkraut, dinner's bread and pork blood sausage, and the midnight snack is a boiled egg per person. Tomorrow's breakfast is indicated to be steamed bread from the previous day, sausage and onion soup. Lunch is steamed bread and chicken stewed with mushrooms, dinner is noodles with meat sauce and a boiled egg, and the midnight snack is scallion pancakes. There are various vegetable soups for all 3 meals a day, and everyone has a fixed amount of tea and Wesson hard candy every day. The food is different every day for 10 days, and the combination of a few meat dishes and various seasonal vegetables is enough to make dozens of meals. Frederick was very satisfied, and then took 2 steps to the side. Here, the types and quantities of clothing, shoes, hats, bedding, daily necessities, etc. received by each soldier were posted. Next to it was the daily schedule: wake up at 6 a.m. for drills, tidy up at 7 a.m., breakfast at 7:30 a.m., training until 12 p.m. for lunch, training at 2 p.m. until 6 p.m. for dinner, cultural studies starting at 6:30 p.m. until 9 p.m. for supper and washing, and bedtime after roll call at 10 p.m. This schedule was proposed by Frederick and then refined by professionals. Everyone felt that time should be used to prevent young people from getting into trouble when they had some free time. After reviewing it, Frederick took old Franz to the back of the kitchen, where the cooks were preparing lunch and dinner for the day. The meat came from a nearby slaughterhouse. Slaughtered pigs hung on the racks, and the cooks were preparing to chop them up and put them into a pressure cooker along with the chopped sauerkraut nearby. The pig bones and vegetables were then used to make soup. Elsewhere, the cook weighed flour, water, and starter dough and placed them in a dough mixer. She closed the lid and turned on the switch. The magical reciprocating mixer stirred the dough into dough. The dough was then rolled into floured molds, cut into long strips, and cut into uniformly sized buns according to the scale on the table. Finally, the dough was placed in steamers to rise. Several other cooks were boiling water. Outside, dozens of wooden barrels, resembling wine barrels, with copper spigots at the bottom, sat on a wheeled rack, numbered with 1 for every 10 people. Frederick observed the situation for a moment, confirming that it was sanitary. It was customary in military camps to hire cooks, but on the battlefield, soldiers either cooked for themselves or had civilians do the cooking. There were no professional cooks. The cooking trailer required considerable technical expertise and would require considerable effort to construct. Not long after, little Franz arrived, having received a tip from the cook. He wore a navy blue, double-breasted officer's uniform, a wide-brimmed hat, riding boots, and a saber slung at his waist. He was a little nervous about his commander's sudden visit, and in his haste, he nearly bumped into a noodle machine on the side of the road. Old Franz glared at his son, urging him to be more careful. Frederick curled his lips and said with a smile, "You're already married, yet you're still so reckless." Young Franz gave an embarrassed smile. Even though they were familiar with each other, the rules still had to be followed. At that time, there was no standard military salute. Generally, one raised their weapons in salute. When unarmed, one would tap their left chest with their right hand over their heart. After saluting, young Franz asked Frederick, "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Frederick smiled and said, "I just came to see you when I thought of it. Let's not disturb them. After they go back to training, we'll go in and have something to eat. We haven't had breakfast yet." Young Franz was about to make arrangements, but Frederick stopped him. The mess hall quickly emptied, and Frederick finally entered and ordered breakfast. The officers' breakfast was similar to the soldiers', but with one difference: an extra sausage and a piece of cheese. In those days, no one talked about equality between officers and soldiers. Officers were aristocrats, soldiers were commoners, a chasm between them. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89 Staff Officer. The training ground soon erupted in a cacophony of chants, shouts, curses, and gunfire. Standing on the barracks roof, Frederick had a commanding view of the entire training ground. Their clothing made it easy to distinguish each individual. The new recruits wore dark gray trousers and short-sleeved pullovers, their combat uniforms. The instructors, wearing black single-breasted uniforms, were hired from the mercenaries. They were authorized to bear arms, with sabers or rapiers dangling from their waists. Officers like Jurgen, wearing navy blue double-breasted uniforms with weapons dangling from their waists, were second-generation knights, currently serving in the army and enjoying the knighthood passed down from their fathers. Frederick could knight Jurgen and the others now, but he was waiting for the war that would soon arrive, to ensure their knightly honors were untainted by the shadow of their fathers. Little Franz stood behind Frederick, waiting for his commander to ask him questions, but after a long wait, No one came. Frederick had tasted braised beef noodles and seen bulls run. In a previous life, he had served in the militia and participated in militia training annually for several years. Coupled with years of keyboard warfare, he was quite capable of speaking. He spearheaded the current training, so he could see the ropes himself. Today's recruits were divided into 4 groups, based on company formations. One company was learning to use firearms at the shooting range, one was running an obstacle course, one was practicing formations, and one was conducting combat drills. There were currently 600 new recruits, 150 to company, 50 to platoon, and 10 to squad. They were organized according to the pikemen, and in battle, they formed a line of 50 men, hence the name platoon. Pikemen were typically arranged in 3 lines, so 3 platoons formed a company. This was the most basic tactical unit commanded on the battlefield, while the squad was the management unit. The number of platoons varied between different armies, ranging from over 30 to 60 or 70, determined by their respective tactical characteristics. As for the mage regiment and cavalry, they had no money. Ever since he used the Wesson sword technique to kill a magic god, Richardnell has been researching the use of new weaponry in the army. On the barracks roof, he could be seen sitting at the shooting range, deep in thought. Frederick initially only wanted to equip part of the army with guns, primarily due to lack of funds, but Richardnell had a different idea, though he hadn't yet fully considered it. "What has Master Richardnell been up to lately?" Frederick asked Little Franz. Little Franz whispered to Frederick, "Master Richardnell has recently found guns more effective than previous weapons, so he's been considering how to incorporate them into the army. He said a few days ago that guns can't simply be used like bows and crossbows, they require new tactics and organizational structures." Frederick nodded slightly. Weapon development, tactics development, and organizational structure development go hand in hand. Such matters should be left to the professionals, while he would focus on earning money and providing the equipment. Speaking of professionals, he suddenly remembered something. Frederick turned to Franz. "You know about the Military Advisory Council, right?" Franz immediately replied, "I do. Do you want to hire a military advisor?" Frederick replied, "I want you to be a staff officer, to form a staff team similar to the Military Advisory Council." Few people could think independently about military strategies and make decisions these days, so military advisors were needed to provide advice to their superiors. Meanwhile, the army also had to handle clerical work, logistics, and military merit calculations, requiring considerable thought. Therefore, military advisors often brought their own teams to handle these intellectual tasks, thus forming a military advisory team. This team had the appearance of a general staff, but lacked clear positions or divisions of labor. Military advisors were not permanent positions, but rather personal advisors to the Lord, and could be dismissed if there were no more battles. In peacetime, the Lord would delegate military affairs to trusted vassals or staff, generally divided into training and logistics, with mutual checks and balances. The recent reforms to various departments in Wessenland created the position of military affairs officer. Many, including Franz, consider this position equivalent to a military advisor, given that the war had only been going on for the past 2 years. However, Frederick planned to establish an organization similar to the Ministry of National Defense, responsible for personnel, military training, administration, and logistics. Recently, with more financial resources available, he also planned to establish a staff agency, headed by a staff officer, subordinate to the military affairs officer. In wartime, they would report directly to Frederick and be responsible for formulating combat and training plans, assisting the commander in commanding and controlling the troops, and gathering and organizing military intelligence. In essence, Frederick would have the final say on whether to go to war and the objectives of a war, while the staff officers would be responsible for achieving those objectives, and the military affairs officer would be responsible for managing the army. Frederick was preparing for the future. Sooner or later, the staff officer would become independent, providing a check and balance with a military affairs officer. However, he currently had no available staff, leaving only the elder and younger Franz, father and son, to shoulder the responsibilities. The others were still young and needed time and experience in the war. These father and son were no fools, they knew when to act. After the younger Franz returned from his training and was given a valuable position, the elder Franz took the initiative to manage football. So when Frederick told young Franz that he wanted him to form a staff similar to a military advisory group, father and son nearly fell off the roof. If they did so, the army of Wessenland would practically fall into their hands. Frederick could sleep soundly. Rebellion wasn't so easy these days. Just as Defy, 1990, number 1, clearly stated that the more thieves' dens there were, the more security measures needed. In a world with extraordinary military power, the powerful and influential people were more concerned with social rules. Under current social rules, it would be easy for knights and commoners to kill him, but replacing him would be out of the question unless they had the support of powerful political figures. Knights were merely thugs for the landlords, not the bosses themselves. The difference in political status was like that between officials and clerks. But old Franz and his son couldn't sleep well. They couldn't rise up the social ladder, but they could resent their peers. Frederick had 11 other young knights under his command. They might not have any ideas now, but what about 10 years from now? The elder and younger Francis exchanged glances, and the younger Franz asked tentatively, "Master, would you please reconsider this?" Frederick replied, "Let's settle this. I trust you to handle the situation. Don't overthink it, we'll talk about future matters later. This position isn't easy. You need to be mentally prepared. You can find experienced and knowledgeable people to oversee operations, training, communications, logistics, and other aspects of the operation. You will be in charge of the overall coordination." He made his point clear, and the younger Franz had no reason to refuse. Frederick concluded, "You're not good at making money, and I'm not good at fighting. Whether Wessenland can be defended is in my hands." Chapter 90 Military Reform. Bang, bang, with a sound of gunfire, the steel chest target 100 meters away fell, clattering thickly onto the grass. Frederick, smiling, handed the pea in his hand to the new recruit beside him. Bobo took the gun, his hands trembling with excitement. Like the others, he looked at his master with admiration. The magic air rifle currently in use has been finalized. The Springfield Armory is still under construction, and a batch has been produced by the Lakeside Blacksmith Works for military trials and training. The current semi-automatic magic air rifle has undergone several changes compared to the one used in the spring trials. Besides a P embossed on the receiver as a code name, a maintenance position has been added to the safety. A match-head-sized crystal on the end of the receiver changes color depending on whether a round is in the chamber. The bayonet mount has been reinforced, the sliding rear sight has a scale, and a soft rubber pad has been added where the buttstock meets the shoulder. Maintenance tools are stored in a small hole in the buttstock, and the magic crystal that provides the energy is mounted inside the buttstock, with a metal cover on the side. The chest target used for shooting practice was made of thick steel, attached to a frame by a steel bar. Hitting the target didn't matter, as long as the bullet landed. The target would shake when hit. Given the recruit's accuracy, the steel bar holding the target took a lot of hits. Frederick aimed for the center of the chest target and landed the final blow. He realized others thought he was aiming for the steel bar, so he decided to call it a day. Frederick shouted to little Franz, "Tomorrow, we'll have a shooting competition for everyone. 10 shots. If you hit the target with 1, you'll get a sausage. If you hit 4 or more, you'll get a chicken leg. If you hit 7 or more, you'll get 2 chicken legs. And if you hit all the targets, you'll get a pork knuckle." The company members practicing shooting heard everything and instantly cheered with joy. May the master be healthy, may the god of light always protect the master, and even may the master have a son soon, Frederick said to them with a chuckle. "Train well. Good performance will earn you a generous reward. By the way, anyone who didn't hit the target with a single shot will be cleaning the toilets." The recruits immediately burst into laughter. Frederick added, "Ammunition costs money. Fired ones have to be collected. Anyone who picks up a bullet at the range during break and turns it in will get a candy in exchange for one. If anyone dares to hide a new bullet and try to get a candy, I'll kick their ass." The recruits burst into laughter again. Frederick left the range and walked around the other companies. After announcing the shooting competition, he was heard telling little Franz to find the best pork knuckle in Wesson territory as a prize. After visiting 4 companies, he went to Richardnell and asked curiously, "Master, what have you been working on lately?" Richardnell sat in a chair by the range, legs crossed, arms folded across his chest, his expression unchanged from the beginning. "Well done," he said, pleased with Frederick's performance. Frederick simply smiled and said nothing more. Military power must be spread not only from the top down but also from the bottom up. Having sufficient prestige among the grassroots ensures that even if someone rebels, They will ultimately be tied up and forced to collect their down payment. Richardal stopped talking about the matter and asked his apprentice earnestly, "Do you know how to win a war?" Frederick's mind was flooded with answers, and for a moment, he didn't know which one to answer. Richardal, assuming he didn't know, said, "To win a war, you must protect yourself and destroy the enemy as much as possible." Frederick nodded. This was a fundamental principle on the battlefield. Richardal continued, "To protect yourself, in addition to martial arts and armor, there is another way, which is to avoid being discovered and hit. This kind of gun can not only be used while standing, but also while lying on the ground, and even covered with grass, so that the enemy can't find you from a distance. If you are in the woods, hide well, set up soundproofing magic around, and eliminate the enemies one by one like calling out names. If it is a defensive battle, you can dig trenches on the ground, connect several trenches in front and back, and walk people in them, which can reduce the damage caused by bows and arrows and magic bombardment. When the enemy is close, go to the next trench. The people in the second trench can also take advantage of the opportunity when they slow down when crossing the trench to eliminate them. If you have enough money, you can equip them with fast-running horses. They don't have to attack the defense line, they just need to use their speed advantage to move to the enemy's weak points, and then use the distance advantage to attack the enemy." Frederick kept a smile on his face, and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He was worthy of being a top figure in the field of killing and could think of so many things. He said, "I think ambush is a good tactic. It's easier to eliminate the enemy on the march than in a deployed formation. The enemy is the same way to us," Richardal said seriously. "Our advantage lies in long-range inflicting damage. If we're attacked at close range, especially by superior warriors, that advantage becomes a disadvantage." Frederick nodded solemnly, pondering the question himself. The existence of supernatural powers creates vast differences in strength between individuals. On the battlefield, a superior team versus a middle team or a middle team versus a lower team rarely result in a loss. A lower team versus a superior team involves trading lives for time, and the duration of that gain depends on the speed of the opponent's swordsmanship and magic. The enemy is no fool. They also know how to exploit their strengths and avoid their weaknesses, and they understand the principle of you fight yours, I fight mine. The principle for both sides in combat is to maximize their strengths and exploit the enemy's weaknesses. We need to make up for the shortcomings, Frederick said thoughtfully. Melee combat ability can be compensated by weapons matching, fighting techniques and other methods. Richardal nodded and said, "My first suggestion is to train the soldiers into masters. With the current diet and training level, plus the training plan I have formulated, you can become an excellent soldier in 2.5 years. It depends on talent to go higher. My second opinion is to change the organization according to the weapon matching. Shooting phalanxes like archers and multilayer shooting like crossbowmen are not advisable. I want to try multi-layer shooting lines." As he spoke, he stretched out his finger and drew one in the air in front of him, and then said, "The smallest group has 4 people. The people at the top 3 vertices are equipped with the current P guns, responsible for attacking enemies within 150 meters to 50 meters. The one at the bottom vertex is the team leader, equipped with a purple mushroom gun, responsible for enemies within 50 meters. The so-called purple mushroom gun is a revolver shotgun. The name comes from a purple mushroom that explodes a field of spores when mature. Everyone thinks that shotgun shooting is quite similar to this kind of mushroom explosion." Richardal continued, 3 such groups form a squad, and the leader of one of the groups is the squad leader. Such a squad is the most basic combat unit. 3 squads form a platoon, and 3 platoons form a company. The grenadiers are organized in the same way. The P guns are replaced with cherry cannons. They deal with enemies within 300 to 150 meters. There is also a squad leader holding a purple mushroom gun who is responsible for approaching enemies. In addition to grenades, they can also be equipped with shotgun shells to deal with tricky enemies at close range. A battalion is composed of 4 P companies and 2 cherry companies. A regiment has 2 such battalions, plus 2 chasseur companies for reconnaissance. During combat, the 3 platoons of the P company are 20 meters apart, and the cherry company is 20 meters behind. The chasseurs defend the rear, and there are people responsible for the enemy from far to near. This is basically the organization of the soldiers. There are officers and non-commissioned officers, as well as doctors, clerks, etc., and more will be added depending on the situation. Frederick calculated in his mind that such a regiment has more than 1,500 combatants, and if commanders and logistics personnel are included, there will be nearly 2,000 people. His mental limit for conscription was 4,000 men, exactly 2 regiments. This would cost a fortune, but he could still manage it with a bit of grit. But Richardnell continued, 2 companies each of mages and cavalry. Frederick looked up, silently gazing at the clouds in the blue sky that obscured the sun, pretending not to hear. He could grit his teeth to raise over 200 light cavalry, but the monthly salary of so many mages, at least 6 florins per man, would be enough to make him cry out in pain. Richardnell surely understood the cost of raising such an army, and since he wasn't one to make irresponsible remarks on major issues, his words must have made sense. The latest news was that the neighbors had already begun preparing for war. Their combined land area was 6 times that of Wessenland, and not counting the new immigrants from last year, their total population was 8 times that of Wessenland. Frederick sighed inwardly. Jet cannons wouldn't be able to keep up with this war. The cost of the barrels was too high, and it wouldn't be possible to obtain sufficient data quickly, as with gun barrels, through extensive testing. The rocket also had problems. The black powder used as propellant was not strong enough. The impact of the combustion caused it to break apart during flight, leading to its explosion. Finally, he could only say, "Then please draft a plan with little France. I'll review it when I return. If it's satisfactory, I'll approve it." Richardnell naturally had no problems. The next morning, Frederick traveled by carriage to Lower. The following day, while out hunting with Baron Philip von Eltel and his family, he was stung by a wasp, leaving him with a pig's head. He decided to stay there to recuperate for a few days. Chapter 91 Entering the Enemy Camp. The land of Ansbach was the most powerful of Wessen's neighbors, its land area more than double that of Wessen and far exceeding that of any other noble territories. Lately, Ansbach has been inundated with visitors, muscular warriors, enigmatic magicians, and merchants from around the country who had finished their business in Wessen to witness the nightly tournament. Even Frederick had dyed his hair and eyebrows burgundy and appeared in Ansbach with Psyche, who had lightly applied makeup. Psyche wore a long red dress, a tall red cone hat, a thick white veil beneath, and a short-sleeved blue jacket with puffy shoulders, slit at the hem to reveal the skirt beneath. Frederick's outfit was particularly eye-catching, a plain dark blue top and a red and black plaid skirt. The locals found it quite novel, but knowledgeable merchants learned that this was the traditional attire of the Northern Caledonia region on the island of England. The 2 men were now the son of a wealthy family from Caledonia, passing through Wessenland on their way to Constantinburg to study. Like everyone else, they had heard of the upcoming night tournament in Ansbach and had come to see the excitement. Behind them followed a young swordsman, sculpted by Psyche using her sculpting magic. Ansbach was bustling with activity, its streets lined with stalls selling various small goods. Frederick pointed to a dried fruit stand and said to Psyche in Poland, "Mother, I want some." Psyche smiled, pulled Frederick over to the fruit stand, gave the vendor a few copper coins, and let him choose. Frederick selected some dehydrated apples, apricots, and raisins, and had the vendor pack them in imported Wessenland plastic bags. He was surprised to receive the money for the bags. As he handed the items to the magic swordsman behind him, he noticed Psyche at a nearby stall asking for the price of clothes hangers made of hardened slime. "Mother," Frederick said, his voice subconsciously tense. "What are you going to buy this for?" He had a psychological trauma about it. Psyche waved the hanger in the air twice, sending a whirring sound. She said with satisfaction, "It feels good." The vendor whispered, "Madam, this is for hanging clothes, not weapons." Psyche smiled and said to the vendor in Rhineland, "You can try hitting a child with it. It's painful but harmless." "Is that so?" Another witch, studying the hanger nearby, also took it up and gestured, finally exclaiming with surprise, "It's really good. It's strong, flexible, and very light." A cute little girl, about Frederick's age, standing next to the old teacher witch, immediately became nervous. "You're not going to buy any." The vendor happily sold 2 bundles of hangers. Frederick and the little girl exchanged glances, each seeing the despair in the other's eyes. "Would you like some raisins?" Frederick asked in Rhineland, offering the raisins. The young girl was dressed in traditional folk clothing from the Osmag Empire, similar to those worn here, a yellow, long-sleeved dress, topped with a black vest, and a blue apron over the dress. Her long, dark blonde hair was tied with a fiery red headscarf. The girl must have been of either wealth or nobility, for she replied in Pyrenees, "Thank you, but no thanks." The 2 groups then parted ways, each going their own way. Frederick and Psyche strolled through the streets before returning to their hotel. It was a decent, above-average 3-story hotel, with a ground floor serving as a restaurant and the second and third floors as accommodations. It was clean and suitable for those of them traveling far and on a tight budget. Frederick walked to the window and drew back the curtains. He noticed that someone in a room across the alley from the back entrance had also drawn their curtains. It was the young girl from before. They both nodded politely and, simultaneously, drew their curtains back. "What's wrong?" Psyche sat on her bed, leaning against the wall, leisurely eating dried apples. "Nothing." Frederick sat down on the bed on the other side of the room. "It seems that Ensbach has been very busy recently." Psyche glared at him fiercely, snapped her fingers, and a transparent soundproof barrier enveloped the room. Then she said, "Be careful what you say when you go out." A clothes hanger flew into the air and hit Frederick on the head several times. Frederick shrank his neck. Now they were behind enemy lines and he had been a little careless. The Wesson family still lacked foundation and did not have its own professional spy system. Now the entire Wesson territory was busy, and some news had to be confirmed by Frederick himself. Frederick was hit on the head with a clothes hanger several times. Although it didn't hurt, he still covered his head and said, "Were you often beaten by your mother with a clothes hanger when you were a child?" Psyche paused slightly with a dried apple in her hand, then shook her head slightly and said, "I have never seen my mother." Frederick was stunned and said, "Sorry, I'm sorry." Psyche suddenly sneered and said, "It's okay, she won't die so easily." Frederick blinked, frowned, and asked her cautiously, "Have you been looking for your mother?" Psyche neither confirmed nor denied, but just ate the dried apples quietly. Seeing that she seemed to be less secretive about this topic today, Frederick felt that this was a breakthrough and asked curiously, "What kind of person is your mother?" Psyche looked at Frederick quietly, and after a moment she said, "I don't know. She ran away after giving birth to me, Alice." Frederick sighed, remembering some past events, and couldn't help saying, "I used to know a man." The fat man picked up a beautiful woman who helped him move steel bars on the roadside. Later, he didn't get married and had a daughter. He held a 100-day celebration and the next day the woman ran away. The fat man raised his daughter alone with great difficulty. During holidays, he had to take her to the construction site, otherwise there would be no one to take care of her. The little girl was a little silly. One day, I was using a Coke bottle to fill soy sauce, and she asked for Coke. I said it was salty Coke and you could only drink one sip at a time. Why are you looking at me like that?" The murderous aura on Psyche's body disappeared in an instant. With an expressionless face, she chewed 2 handfuls of dried apples before saying, "I don't understand what you are saying." Seeing her say this, Frederick stopped talking and got back to business. "Well, the tournament starts tomorrow. How can we get tickets?" Tickets for the tournament came in many varieties, ranging from as cheap as 1 cruise to as expensive as 1 florin, but they were sold out, and scalpers were out of luck. Psyche, looking familiar with such matters, said, "Go downstairs to the tavern tonight. Maybe someone will cheat and use your tickets for a bet." Frederick immediately shook his head and said, "I don't gamble, not even touch it." Psyche, chewing on the last piece of dried apple, said without looking up, "Then you figure it out yourself." Frederick could only lazily lie on his bed, pondering how to get tickets. In previous years, Count Ansbach had a dozen knights and 4 or 5 skilled magicians under his command, but half of them had been lost in the previous war. This year, Count Ansbach was holding a tournament after the summer harvest to round up his 30 knights and 10 magicians. The territory of Ansbach had remained relatively unchanged in recent years, but now, with a sudden increase in the number of its vassals, anyone with a discerning eye could see that this was a military buildup. It wasn't just here. The neighbors surrounding Wessenland had chosen to hold nightly tournaments after the summer or autumn harvests this year, as if by appointment. Count Ansbach was Wessenland's greatest impending enemy, so Frederick personally infiltrated the tournament to assess the strength of the enemy's core forces. Chapter 92. Let's play a game. That evening, Frederick went to the tavern downstairs. It was quite lively, but there was a mix of good and bad people. Apart from the waiters and the proprietress, no decent women would be seen there, and neither should children. He found an empty table and, imitating an adult, asked the waitress for a glass of wine without water. The young waitress didn't move. At this moment, a customer at the next table touched the gluteus maximus of his waiter, which caused a coquettish moan, followed by a burst of laughter. Frederick looked at the waiter next to him and his own. The waiter next to him had a flower tied in his ear, while the one on his side didn't. He held out his hand, looking puzzled, and said, "Do I have to touch you before you bring me a drink?" The young woman burst out laughing. She understood some common Purelanese, and stifled a laugh as she said, "Sir, it's too early for you to drink. Would you like some milk? We have imported sweet milk from Wesson. It's delicious and even makes you smarter." At this point, a customer at a nearby table said lewdly, "Oh, Wesson's milk is nowhere near as good as yours." The waitress turned away with a cold expression and said, "Sir, please respect yourself." The customer was stunned for a moment, a little angry. The waitress he had just touched immediately came over, sat on his lap, whispered something in his ear, and then they went upstairs. Frederick, startled, understood what was going on. He said to the waitress, "Milk, please. Give me a glass." The waitress smiled and asked for 30 copper coins. Frederick's mouth twitched. Oh my God, Manuel's bottled milk with maltose was being sold here, and the owner had the audacity to mark it up sixfold. He took a few sips of milk and looked around curiously. Sure enough, someone was using tickets as stakes. The man's rules were simple: you had to win 10 cruises and then win again to get a ticket. As Frederick was trying to figure out how to approach the dealer, a gadget vendor approached, offering him a crude wooden dragonfly. Frederick chatted with him in Pulan, a language he'd traveled extensively to speak. The crude wooden dragonfly cost less than a glass of milk, so Frederick bought it and curiously asked the ticket better if they were playing a game. 2 minutes later, another person left after losing a significant amount of money. Frederick sat down in the empty chair, curious. The dealer was a middle-aged man with a full beard and a stocky build, looking quite formidable. "Go play somewhere else," the dealer said, waving his hand to shoo Frederick away like a fly. The merchant recognized the dealer and had accepted Frederick's money to act as an interpreter, so he said, "Hey, this young gentleman wants to play with you, so why don't you play a few rounds with him?" The dealer rolled his eyes at him and said unhappily, "Asshole, you comfort him when he cries." The merchant's face immediately showed a vulgar expression, and he whispered in the dealer's ear, "The child came with his mother and a little girl bodyguard. They live upstairs. If he cries, you take him upstairs." The dealer glared at the merchant fiercely and said angrily in a low voice, "Ansbachkers. If you didn't owe me money, I would slap you to death right now. Anyone who dares to travel far away by themselves these days is easy to mess with." The merchant said aggrievedly, "Hey, I didn't ask you to force me. You have several tickets, don't you have to pay for them?" A kind smile gradually spread across the dealer's face. He carefully studied Frederick, figuring that his son, so handsome, must have a good mother. Furthermore, the rings on his fingers looked quite valuable, suggesting he was a merchant from out of town. He wouldn't lose out no matter what. He immediately asked, "What's your name, sir?" After the merchant translated, Frederick replied, "My name is Charles." He had heard the conversation between the two men, but he didn't care. The dealer then asked, "Are you here alone?" Frederick replied docilely, "No, I'm with my mother and sister." Hearing no one else was around, the dealer's smile widened. He pushed the dice and playing cards to the center of the table and asked, "What do you want to play?" He had dice and playing cards, and they were processed. He played poker with someone watching the cards from behind and giving hints, specifically to trick outsiders. Frederick pointed to a pile of silver coins on the table and said, "Let's play coin picking. You grab a handful of coins and place them on the table. You and I will take turns picking them off to the side, picking up 1 to 3 coins at a time. Whoever gets the last one loses, and the loser pays the winner a silver coin. What do you say?" The dealer's face twitched noticeably, but then he thought, this child's game is so simple, there's no reason for him to lose. Frederick pulled 6 silver coins from his pocket and placed them in front of him. 2 of them were Cruise coins, and the others were Caledonian coins, obtained in the Duchy of Mainz. After placing the coins, he rolled up his sleeves and said, "Let's begin." The dealer followed suit, rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a handful of coins, and spread them in the middle of the table, saying, "You go first." Frederick counted the coins on the table. There were 19, and pushed 2 aside. Wanting to finish quickly, the dealer pushed 3 coins aside, leaving 14 on the table. Frederick pretended to ponder for a long time and removed 1 silver coin, leaving 13. The dealer thought for a moment and removed 2, leaving 11. Frederick then removed 2, leaving 9. The dealer removed 3 more, leaving 6. Then Frederick removed 1, leaving 5. The dealer's outstretched hand paused in midair, realizing that no matter how many coins he removed next, he would lose. He removed 3 in a single swoop, and Frederick removed 1, leaving a single silver coin alone in the middle of the table. The dealer, a seasoned casino expert, chuckled and pushed a silver coin in front of Frederick, then collected all the coins and placed another handful on the table. Just then, someone knocked on the door of Frederick's room. Psyche opened the door and saw a waitress in the hallway. Amidst the harmonious sounds of life coming from the next room, she asked, "What's going on?" The waitress who had just sold milk to Frederick said anxiously, "Dear madam, your son is gambling downstairs." Psyche's expression remained unchanged. She simply asked, "Who is he betting with?" The waitress, a little nervous, whispered, "The second in command of the city's Scorpion gang." Psyche said, "Oh," and before closing the door, "No problem, he's back after losing all his money." The waitress paused, then knocked on the door again. "What's going on?" Psyche asked, opening the door. The waitress anxiously said, "Madam, the Scorpion gang is no good. They'll gamble away all your money, leave you with a lot more, and then force you to pay back at knife point." Psyche smiled faintly and asked, "What's your name? How old are you?" The waitress was stunned before replying, "Lena, I'm 15, Lena from N's batch." Psyche nodded. "I'll remember you. Good people will be rewarded." She closed the door. Lena stood there for a moment, stunned. She looked towards the room next door, where a noise was coming from. Finally, she sighed deeply and went downstairs. When she returned, she found the place bustling with activity. Many people were gathered around the table where the Scorpion gang's underboss was gambling. Amidst the booing, the underboss roared and slammed the table in anger. Frederick took the silver coins he had won, a broad smile on his face. Chapter 93, Tickets Obtained. The game Frederick proposed wasn't difficult. No matter how many coins the opponent took away, the remaining silver coins must be an integer multiple of 4 plus 1. Understanding the mathematical principles would be simple, but the Scorpion gang's underling didn't understand much. Consequently, in the short time since then, Frederick had won 10 rounds, losing 2 and 3 rounds in a row. The underling, acting as the banker, didn't care about the small amount of money. The real issue was the humiliation of losing so many times to a child. "Let's raise the stakes." The underling's face flushed. 5 silver coins around. After someone translated, Frederick smiled and said, "Okay, no problem." Frederick then won 6 rounds in a row. The onlookers cheered, sympathizing with the underdog and naturally siding with the child. Among the crowd were several members of other city gangs, and their voices were particularly harsh to the underling's ears. 10 silver coins around, the underling's eyes bloodshot, his head buzzing. He tried his best to calm himself. If it were anyone else, he could have just punched him, but this time the opponent was a child, and there were many outsiders around. Beating him to death in public would be a real nuisance. If he didn't get even, he'd lose face and have to pay the money back. The second in command, remembering the first in command's fury, shuddered. The onlookers assumed he was shaking from another loss and paid no attention. Frederick, however, had more silver coins in front of him than his opponent. Figuring it was time to call it quits, he won 2, then lost 3 in a row, won 1, and then lost 2 more in a row. He was an expert at feigning defeat, having learned it from Maria. If it weren't for Philip's self-control, he would have already won Maria home. Seeing his lucky hand rising, the second in command's mind, the gambler's mindset of guaranteed to win on the next hand, took over. He grabbed a handful of silver coins and threw them onto the table, roaring, "This one decides the outcome. Win or lose." The crowd booed, as Frederick's money seemed a bit larger. Frederick feigned shock, stunned for a moment, then hunched his neck and said, "This isn't good. How about we just stop here tonight and play tomorrow?" How could the other party just let him get away with the money? His eyes reddened, widened, and he clenched his fists, angrily demanding, "What do you think this place is? You can come and go as you please." The translator, offering a plea, then got punched, knocking out 2 teeth. Terrified, Frederick huddled in his chair. After listening to the other's translation, he cried out in a sobbing voice, "I'm sorry, Count Ansbach, I didn't know it was you. I'm playing, I'm just going to keep playing. Don't hit me." The expressions of those present who could understand Pulin suddenly shifted to a strange state. With that, Frederick reached out with a trembling hand and pushed a silver coin from the middle of the table to the edge, leaving 21 coins. He didn't give the other party time to translate his words. A minute later, the second in command stood stunned by the table, sweat pouring down his forehead. After a long moment, he gritted his teeth, turned, and headed for the back door. Like a delighted monkey, Frederick leaped onto the table and stuffed the tickets and some silver coins into his pockets. Then, looking across the crowd, he saw the second-in-command grabbing a waiter by the neck and dragging him toward the back door. Frederick immediately filled his pockets and stuffed a good bit more into his collar. Then, standing upright at the table, hands on his hips, he triumphantly declared, "Tonight's my treat. Everyone, drink up the rest of your money. The most expensive grapes here cost a cruise per 5-liter bucket." The money on the table was enough for everyone to drink all night. In the dark alley behind the inn, sewage flowed thickly, and rats with dark green eyes and fist-sized slimes could be seen fighting over food scraps on the ground. Lena was slammed against the wall, the back of her head hitting the hard stone. It took several breaths for her to recover from the dizziness. The second-in-command held a thumb-sized ceramic bottle and said to the girl, "Put this in the wine and give it to that family." Lena pressed her back against the wall, as if to escape through the stone, but a chill ran down her back. She trembled like a sieve and replied timidly, I won't kill anyone." She had seen a lot working here, and she knew what was going on the moment she saw the bottle. 8 florins, 6 crews, 8 coppers. Either do as I say, or pay me back now. Lena's body trembled with every word the second-in-command spoke. In a low voice, she asked, "Didn't you say yesterday that you only had 3 florins left to pay?" The second-in-command raised his hand to slap her, but thought it would be difficult to administer drugs if his face was swollen. "Whatever I say is what I say." He hooked his fist into Lena's stomach. Lena fell to the ground, her body bent like a boiled shrimp, shaking even more violently, a layer of cold sweat on her head. The second-in-command looked at his hand and felt as if he had just brushed against something truly formidable, something he hadn't noticed before due to his loose clothing. "Holy!" The second-in-command grabbed Lena's neck and lifted her up, a lewd smile on his face. "You've grown up." The second-in-command put the medicine bottle back into his pocket and held out his other hand. "It's okay if you don't do it, then do something else to repay your debt. By the way, you have a sister, right? You'll be able to repay your debt faster if you work together." Lena's eyes were filled with fear, but her throat was strangled and she couldn't speak. Her hands and feet could only kick and thrash in vain. Suddenly, she stopped kicking and hitting the second-in-command and pointed behind him, shaking even more violently. The second-in-command, thinking someone was approaching from behind, turned around and was about to shut down the meddling individual, but the next second, he was so frightened that he fell to the ground. Any normal person would be terrified to see a story-high tentacle monster appear in a dark alley, its monstrous tentacles wriggling before them. In this moment of life and death, the second-in-command reverted to his gangster fighting ways, grabbing Lena by the belt and throwing her toward the tentacle monster before turning and running. However, the tentacle monster had already laid a tight net, with the surrounding alleys and walls covered in vine-like green tentacles. The second-in-command had barely taken a few steps when his hands and feet were bound. 2 tentacles crawled up the backs of his hands, then forked again, and again, quickly controlling both hands and fingers. Panic and despair filled the second-in-command's eyes as the monster manipulated his hands to remove the bottle of poison, uncap it, tilt his head back, and pour the poison into his pried-open mouth, then tightly grasp the bottle and cap. When dawn came, they would discover that he had committed suicide out of fear of punishment by using the poison he had brought with him. "You didn't see anything," Frederick kept whispering in the local dialect beside Lena, "sometimes left, sometimes right, sometimes far, sometimes near." The little girl was tied up like a mummy by the entwined waterweed magic that Psyche gave to Frederick, and she couldn't even nod. "Leave here, go east," Frederick continued to whisper in her ear. Lena didn't know when she fainted or how long she had been unconscious. When she woke up, she found a corpse lying not far away. She was so scared that she rushed home immediately, not even noticing that her pockets were full of silver coins. The next day, before dawn, as soon as the gates of Ansbach were opened, carriages carrying meat, vegetables, and other food to the city passed by caravans that were rushing to Wessenland to purchase goods. In one of the caravans, Lena was holding a little girl who was 3 or 4 years younger than herself, huddled under a pile of waterproof cloth, not daring to breathe. When the carriage stopped, Lena heard the driver unhook the carriage and take the horses to the stable to feed them and walk away. She immediately lifted the waterproof cloth and crawled out. Then she saw a pair of eyes staring at her from the side of the carriage. Chapter 94 Ancient History. The summer sun was scorching, and the heat was even more intense at the nightly tournament outside the city. A crowd of people sat together, a mingling of smells. Even a swordmaster might have been overwhelmed. Fortunately, there was a strong breeze, otherwise the tournament wouldn't have been able to continue. Frederick's ticket was for the VIP seats, with an overhead awning to block the sun. He could find a seat wherever he wanted after entering. The best seats were across the street, where the Count of Ansbach and his family were already seated. Some were fanning themselves, while others were offering cold, delicious beer. Frederick took a quick look. He recognized the family. Count Ansbach looked much more haggard. His son had lost a leg in a battle 2 years before, and was said to have gone insane. His second son, now 16 or 17, had returned from the church last year and officially become the heir to the title. He looked very high-spirited, and it was said that Count Ansbach wanted to ask King William for a wife of royal blood for him. The Count's youngest daughter was 13 or 14, old enough to be engaged. Mrs. Ansbach's dress was as gorgeous as ever, and from a distance, she resembled her nickname among the ladies of the world, Hydrangea. Frederick glanced at her, then found a seat with Psyche and realized he had met the person next to him before. Hello, raisins, thank you, but no. Frederick withdrew his hand and grabbed a few raisins to eat. Wesson County wasn't very suitable for growing grapes. The grapes weren't sweet enough to make good wine. Later, someone discovered that making raisins from them could save on winemaking costs and earn more than selling inferior wine. With some time left before the meeting started, Frederick struck up a conversation with the girl next to him. My name is Charles, and this is my mother, Elizabeth. What's your name? He unconsciously touched his hair as he spoke. My name is Teresa, the little girl replied. This is my teacher, Frau Pentagon. Frederick began to babble. Teresa, where are you from? My home is at Hogwarts. There's a huge castle with a huge lake next to it. I'm going to Constantine to study magic, and then when I return home I'll open a magic school in the castle. Psyche stroked his head and said, and every year on the first day of school, I'll make dumplings in the kitchen with the professors. Here, too, there were dumpling-like foods wrapped in thin dough, with a wide variety of fillings and shapes. A popular dish in Wessenland and the surrounding areas was called monk dumplings, where priests of the Church of Light supposedly wrapped meat filling in 2 square dough sheets to secretly eat meat during Lent. In the kingdom of Pest, there were also jam-filled dumplings, also eaten during festivals. Teresa covered her mouth with her hand and laughed, and Pentagon, sitting next to her, also smiled. Huh? Pentagon suddenly raised the wide brim of her black, pointed witch hat and looked intently across at Count Ansbach, whispering, It's her. Frederick looked over curiously and saw a female magician wearing a dark green witch hat and matching robes appear behind Count Ansbach. He turned and asked Pentagon, Ms. Pentagon, is she your friend? Pentagon replied with a half-smile, I've met her once before. She's the descendant of the summoner. Frederick was taken aback. What was a summoner? He had never heard of one. Pentagon continued, until yesterday, no magician had dared to apply here. She must have something to rely on. Frederick had been keeping track of the number of magicians Count Ansbach was recruiting, but there was no news. He had assumed it was due to a well-kept secret, but he hadn't expected anyone to apply. He asked curiously, why don't the magicians dare to come here? Are they cowards? Pentagon smiled at him and said, because Wesson has Baron Wesson in Wessenberg University. Now magicians in the surrounding areas can go to Wessenberg University to study. If they want to make money, they can ask Baron Wesson to guide them. It's much better than risking their lives on the battlefield. Frederick blinked, feeling that his identity had been discovered, but he didn't say it. He asked again, excuse me, what is a summoner? Can they summon gold coins? After Pentagon glanced at Psyche, he said, summoner is a very ancient profession. It is said that it existed before Ragnarok, when the gods appeared in the world. Summoners can use magic to go to a place called World of Warcraft and sign a contract with the Warcraft. After returning, they can summon the contracted Warcraft to fight with them, but after Ragnarok, the subspace of Warcraft has lost contact with us, and summoners can no longer go there. Then Psyche said in a voice that only they could hear, the conditions to become a summoner are very harsh. You need to master space magic to go to that place, and you have to be a tamer, but this was a long time ago. After Ragnarok, the locations of various spaces were all messed up, and some were even destroyed. Summoners can't go to that place. Frederick frowned tightly. What the hell is this Ragnarok? Pentagon asked Psyche seriously, Madam Elizabeth, do you know the truth about Ragnarok? Psyche whispered, I'm also searching for the truth, but all I have is what's passed down within the sisterhood." Frederick's frown deepened. He'd heard of the witch sisterhood, but outsiders only knew it was a long-standing organization of female magicians, constantly engaged in archaeological excavations, seemingly searching for relics. The ancient histories currently circulating were all told by each church according to its own doctrines. The common thread was that the world was created by its own God. Later, due to humanity's various misdeeds, a black demon appeared on Earth, indiscriminately slaughtering all living things. Eventually, humanity came to its senses, and messengers of God arrived to slay the demon's leader. With repentance in their hearts, humanity slew the remaining demons, and from then on, they lived a pious and happy life. Frederick had never heard of summoners or Ragnarok. At first, he thought it was just a legend passed down by a small group, but when he realized Psyche was also following this, he knew it was more than just a story. "Don't overthink it," Psyche said to him. "It's just some old legend." Frederick nodded. Now was not the time to delve into history. At that moment, the sound of trumpets drifted over the field, and the contestants for today's nightly tournament began to enter. Chapter 95 Qualifying Round. Amidst the cheers of the audience, the contestants for today's nightly tournament entered the arena one after another. Among the 50 or so knights, only 3 were tin-canned, the rest wore a combination of half-plate armor and chain mail. "Poor fellow," Teresa muttered. Frederick nodded and said, "Yeah, what's the point of eating a few apricots? The purpose of this tournament was to select knights, not to compete among them, so those who participated were those who aspired to cross the social ladder through martial arts. As the saying goes, the rich are the scholars, the rich are the warriors, the rich are the magicians." Regardless of the subject, the cost of hiring a teacher and daily expenses is high, adding up to a considerable annual expense. Common martial artists often came from more affluent families, such as fallen nobles, small merchants, hunters, veterans, or thieves who had made a fortune. Veterans and hunters could avoid the expense of hiring a teacher. Children trained from a young age, once they had mastered martial arts by the age of 15 or 16, would become knights squires, traveling merchants, blacksmiths, and poachers, honing their skills while supporting themselves. In their early 20s, driven by a thirst for power and wealth, they traded their saved gold for weapons, joining the military, mercenaries, caravan bodyguards, and warcraft hunters, further honing their skills in these demanding jobs. Many stopped there, while others chose to cross the class barrier. At current prices, a set of ordinary steel armor costs around 20 florins, while common half-plate and chain mail are 4 to 5 florins. A barrel helmet with its padding costs a little over 1 florin, and ordinary weapons cost 2 or 3 florins. As for magical weapons, ordinary enchanted weapons cost several times more than the original weapons. Even the most basic flaming sword, with flames emanating from its blade comparable to burning wood, could be purchased for under a dozen florins. Frederick's father's enchanted steel armor with rock armor was originally forged in the family's blacksmith shop, enchanted by a familiar hand, and cost over 200 florins. To be able to use magical equipment, one had to first become a knight, then either assemble one piece themselves or receive some from their boss. Frederick observed them carefully for a moment. Their weapons and equipment were quite ordinary, but their builds suggested they were all thick-necked and broad-shouldered. The competition began quickly, starting with a lance event. The first competition required the competitors to pierce a wooden stake the size of a human face, mounted horizontally on a rack, at the rider's heart level. This was a qualifying round for the following competition. Anyone who failed to pierce the stake 5 times was dismissed. While knightly warfare employed a variety of weapons, the Rhine Confederation Knights, defeated by the Gallic Lightning Rangers' lance charge in the previous year's war, were now adopting their example. However, Frederick was skeptical of this reform. This unique tactic, from the horses and equipment to the accompanying magic and training, was highly targeted, developed through the experience gained at the cost of human lives. For another thing, the Gallic kingdom's higher crop yields, resulting in better-fed war horses, were enough to create a significant gap. Furthermore, the various unseen details were notable. Simplistic imitation would be counterproductive. "No," Teresa shook her head repeatedly. "The horses are terrible, and neither are the riders. They're too stiff." Frederick was a little surprised. He hadn't expected this young woman to know so much. She seemed to have received a good education. Most of the competitors' horses were cheap war horses worth around 20 florins, barely above the passing grade. Only the 3 tin-canned horses were worth 40 to 50 florins, considered average. Many had clearly not received the update and were unaccustomed to fighting with 4-meter-long spears. Their coordination was unsettling, and many were wielding their spears with both hands. The first day of the nightly tournament was filled with laughter. Every time one of the knights galloped and missed, the audience erupted in laughter. Only 1 tin-can and fewer than 10 others made it through the first round. The second and third rounds were better, with over 20 people making it through once they got the hang of it. By the end of the 5 rounds, nearly 10 had been eliminated. The next day's event was to cut down wooden stakes. On either side of the brittleway were racks of varying heights, roughly the height of the cavalry and infantryman's genitals, topped with wooden stakes. Competitors were tasked with galloping across the course while simultaneously using their weapons to knock the stakes off the racks. This challenge tested fundamental horsemanship skills, requiring not only a fast horse and accurate weapons, but also sufficient strength to knock the heavy stakes off the ground. Frederick felt he wasn't up to the task. But Teresa remarked, "That's easy. Anyone in my hometown can do it." Curious, Frederick asked, "Can you do it too?" Teresa replied proudly, "Of course I can. If you want me to teach you, you can treat me to some Wessenland." Frederick simply smiled. Wessenland's cultural exports began with Wessenland and steambrod, something Frederick had never anticipated. Now, vendors in Ansbach sell these buns, imitating the Wessenland tradition by making them and selling them in plastic bags. Yesterday at noon, Teresa tried one, and it was surprisingly to her liking. Frederick even had a plan. The Wesson family's intelligence agency would use the shop selling steam bread and Wesson buns as its base, codenamed Steam Bun Bureau. By the way, Teresa suddenly asked, "Do you know how to ride a horse? If not, I can teach you." "What should I treat you to?" Frederick smiled and asked, "What do you like to eat?" "Meat." Teresa's face lit up. "I love meat the most," Frederick said. "Just meat won't do." Teresa snorted, annoyed. "Why are you just like that old woman? So annoying." Then, she turned to watch a contestant chopping wood, ignoring Frederick. Frederick smiled and shook his head, then stopped talking to her, continuing to assess the strength of his future opponents. The contestants all performed well, and the atmosphere in the audience was much more lively than yesterday, with occasional cheers. Frederick kept mentally calculating the speed of the players on the field, and initially estimated that the peace spear could effectively kill them. At the end of the day, several more people were eliminated due to poor performance. On the third day, the event that the audience had long awaited took place. More than 30 players fought against each other in an elimination tournament to determine the final winner. The top 16 would directly become knights, and the remaining players would have a chance to compete in a resurrection match. The size of the fiefdom was related to the ranking. Psyche touched Frederick's head and said seriously, "Next is the part you need to pay the most attention to. Watch how they fight." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96 Fighting Competition. The third day's combat was foot combat. The first match pitted a tin-can against a young man who couldn't even afford a barrel helmet. Magical equipment wasn't allowed during combat. The tin-can wielded a longsword, while the young man wielded a warhammer, though he could use magic. "Who do you think will win?" Teresa asked Frederick. Without hesitation, Frederick replied, "Definitely the tin-can." Teresa paused for a moment before realizing he was referring to the man in full plate armor. She laughed and said, "Ha ha ha ha, you're so funny. Yeah, it does look like a man in a tin can. I think he'll win." 2. At the start of the match, the tin-can raised his sword high with both hands, leaning back as if about to strike a vertical blow. A layer of white mist enveloped the blade. This made it appear as if he had no defense below him, allowing a faster opponent to strike him with a hammer strike. However, fighting with armor differed from fighting without it. The protection provided by armor eliminated many defensive maneuvers, allowing the opponent to focus more on offense. If Ironcon were struck by a hammer in the waist at this moment, the armor and its inner padding would absorb much of the energy, minimizing damage. There was no need to worry about the head either. The barrel helmet also had thick padding for shock absorption. The limited space between the helmet and the armor limited its range of motion, preventing the HUD from breaking its neck due to excessive deflection. Frederick had seen magical disguises before, and for a moment he wasn't sure what the white mist covering Iron Can's sword was for. Perhaps it was decorative, perhaps a forbidden spell, something only experienced people could tell. An improved freezing mist, Pontigan began teaching Teresa, not avoiding Frederick. This type of magic primarily allows icy air to penetrate the crevices of armor, freezing the person and slowing their movements. This is a must-learn spell for fully armored warriors. Besides dealing with enemies, you can cast this spell on yourself to cool down after wearing full armor and padding, which can be very hot. Teresa nodded in agreement. Psyche added, this spell has been significantly modified. It's a second-stage spell. There are some large ice cores in the ice mist. Once they penetrate the armor, they'll quickly absorb the ice element and form spikes or cones. This time, it was Frederick's turn to nod repeatedly, thinking this was truly insidious. He really liked it. Those who could use second-stage magic were naturally gifted and well-educated in magic. It seemed this tin can came from a well-off background, wealthy, educated, talented, and capable. How could he possibly lose? Bang! Tin Can's sword didn't strike down. Instead, it suddenly flew backwards, slamming heavily against the wooden wall, shaking the audience on that side. Amid the rapturous cheers of the surrounding audience, Frederick and Teresa both gaped in shock. Teresa asked anxiously, what just happened? Battering ram, Frederick replied in surprise. The person opposite suddenly kicked Tin Can in the chest. It was so fast that it flew away. He had heard Richardner talk about many common folk magics, and the battering ram was one of them. Battering rams are a type of wind magic, often used with long weapons like spears and thrusting weapons. When mastered, their power can shatter wooden doors, making them an excellent countermeasure against the Iron Can cavalry. However, using one's own legs to perform this move was unheard of. The Iron Can staggered to his feet, looked around, and then began to spin around, as if searching for something. Teresa asked curiously, what's wrong with that guy? Frederick's mouth twitched, and he replied, I think he's looking for his sword. Teresa was even more puzzled, and said, but his sword is right in his hand. Frederick laughed, then observed carefully before saying, I'm afraid he's still dazed and his brain isn't working properly. Teresa uttered a no. The rest of the audience also caught on, bursting into laughter. Finally, the young man on the field couldn't bear it anymore and rushed forward to end the match with a single blow of his hammer. This result was beyond the expectations of most, and the audience erupted in curses. It was obvious at first glance that these people were gamblers. Frederick, bewildered, turned to Psyche and asked, is that the end? Psyche replied, how else? Do I have to kill him? Don't underestimate the winner. He's more powerful than that. Frederick asked curiously, how did you tell? Psyche smiled faintly and replied, he uses magic from a different system. Otherwise, his body wouldn't have been able to withstand the battering ram just now. Frederick pondered thoughtfully. According to this, the opponent's magic mainly focused on strengthening the body, supplemented by various offensive magic. The second match began, and the audience yawned. Two players, one specialized in ice armor and the other in rock armor, competed on the field to see who could break the other's defense first. Frederick was a little troubled. To deal with such an enemy, he might need to mobilize half a platoon to concentrate fire. Suddenly, Pontigan turned to Psyche and asked, Ms. Elizabeth, is the winner of the first match your descendant? Psyche calmly replied, I've only taught the magic of Peach Blossom Stone to the sisters in the sorority. After all these years, I'm probably the descendant of one of the sisters. Frederick, startled, immediately asked, is that the magic of Peach Blossom Stone? Psyche nodded slightly. Have you been to Peach Blossom Stone? Teresa suddenly became excited. Can you tell me what it's like there? Someone once tried to sell me golden beans from Peach Blossom Stone. They were 5 florins each, but I didn't have enough money at the time, so I only bought one. Otherwise, why are you looking at me like that? Frederick and Psyche's eyes simultaneously flashed with concern for the Zerg players. Nothing, Frederick said. Drink more milk. Teresa's delicate brows furrowed, sensing a hidden meaning in his words. Frederick continued to watch the match, mentally assessing their strength. He'd talk about the magic of Peach Blossom Stone later. The subsequent matches were sometimes exciting, some dull, and even one resulted in a fatality. The young man who won the first match performed exceptionally well, demonstrating formidable physical fitness, superb martial arts skills, and agile intelligence. He remained unscathed by enemy weapons until his victory in the finals. Frederick remembered this young man, Tony, and would focus his fire on him whenever he appeared on the battlefield. Others with defensive expertise should also be on guard, as they might be able to forge ahead and break through the fire blockade. Chapter 97, Competition Champion comes to vote. Goodbye, goodbye, why do you want to take some raspberries with you? Okay. Teresa took a bag of dried raspberries from Frederick's hand, then turned and got on the carriage. After watching the excitement, Teresa continued to travel around with Pontigan, and Frederick also had to go back to Lurk to spend a few days with Maria, and then publicly return to Wessenland. As a result, when he returned to Wessenberg, he was surprised by the visitor who had been waiting for him for a few days. Tony, Frederick frowned. Is there something wrong with Count Ansbach? He thought to himself. The heat of the night tournament has not yet subsided, and Count Ansbach sent the champion here. Is he going to cause trouble? Tony was wearing a newly bought suit, his light golden hair was combed meticulously, his blue eyes were very bright, and his expression was very serious. Baron Wesson, he said respectfully, I have no connection to Count Ansbach. I entered the tournament simply because I was broke, and after receiving the prize money, I came here to fulfill a promise. He then added, somewhat embarrassedly, I didn't have any good clothes at the time, and I wanted to earn some prize money to buy new ones before returning to see you, sir. I just didn't expect those people were so weak, and I accidentally won the championship. He then pulled a letter from his pocket and handed it to Alfred. Frederick took the parchment and carefully read it 3 times before deciphering the meaning of the letter, which was riddled with errors. He then showed the letter to Alfred, who read it carefully several times before nodding to his master and handing it to Richardner, who had been urgently summoned. Frederick quietly sipped his tea. His father had left a letter with Tony that outlined how the two men met. The errors were code words, and Alfred confirmed that the code words were correct. Years earlier, Count Henry von Wesson was stationed by a river outside Cologne while on a campaign. Instead of reveling in the city, he went fishing while awaiting King William's order to depart. There, he encountered Tony, a clumsy fisherman, and taught him how to fish. Henry learned from their conversation that Tony's father was ill, but medicine was too expensive to buy, so he had secretly come to the river to fish for his father's health. Henry then gave Tony his purse and instructed him to go to the apothecary in town to buy medicine. The purse contained not only some silver coins but also several gold coins. Tony thanked him and immediately went to buy medicine. A few days later, he returned to the river, returned the remaining money, and offered Henry his services. Henry, like many others, feared the war would be protracted. Concerned that old France would be overwhelmed by the family alone, he wrote a letter of recommendation for him, asking him to come to Wesson to help France once his father's health improved. It's just that Tony's father has been seriously ill for too long and is very weak. He has to take medicine and recuperate until this year before he can travel far. After reading the letter, Richardnell asked Tony earnestly, "What's the riverbed like?" Tony, very reserved in front of the swordmaster, answered cautiously, "The riverbed is covered with lush green water plants, and beneath the water plants is mud." Richardnell asked again, "How does he fish?" Tony immediately replied, "Count Wesson uses earthworms as bait and also sprinkles wheat soaked in wine into the water." "That's right," Richardnell said confidently to Frederick, "using wheat soaked in wine to make a nest in areas with mud and water plants, and using earthworms as bait is indeed Henry's common practice. It's his little secret." Tony continued, "Count Wesson's method works well, and I've caught a lot of fish." Frederick finally asked Tony, "What do you want to do with me?" Tony said seriously, "Count Wesson saved my father's life. Now I will repay the Count's kindness by protecting him with my own life." Psyche, summoned to act as a lie detector, nodded to Frederick, confirming his deception. Frederick pondered for a moment, then said to Richardnell, "Master, I'll leave him to you. I think he's quite suited to the position." Richardnell also considered the matter and said, "All right, let him try." Tony smiled. He feared Frederick would distrust him and drive him away, which would be disastrous. Then his smile faded, and Richardnell asked him to follow him downstairs. In the castle's training grounds, Richardnell grabbed the training sword from the weapons rack and asked Tony to choose his preferred weapon. Tony hung his coat on the rack, unbuttoned a few buttons on his shirt, and grabbed a round shield and a medium-length sword. He then stood 5 meters from Richardnell, ready for battle. The sword master raised his hand and hooked his finger, signaling him to attack. Tony's skin suddenly darkened. The battering ram reappeared, this time using both legs simultaneously. The immense recoil sent him hurtling forward at breakneck speed. Richardel took a moment to turn and give Psyche a sullen look. Then, with a flick of his sword, there was no sound or light. Tony, charging straight ahead, was deflected by the cheap training sword, hurtling sideways. He seemed unable to stop, and was about to pass Richardel. Just as he was about to pass him, Tony swerved, attempting a flank attack. But Richardel remained motionless, allowing Tony to charge past him from behind. Just a little bit, Richardel turned to Tony and asked, "What kind of books do you usually read?" Tony was stunned, then shook his head and replied, "I can't afford books. I've been studying the 3 properties of force and the energy of motion, and a conjecture on why we stand on the earth," Richardel said seriously. "If you'd studied it, you'd have helped me move just now. I think this is your first time turning so quickly at such a speed, and you didn't consider the deviation caused by your body's immense inertia." Tony thought for a moment. It was indeed his first time using such speed. He had noticed a force causing his movements to deviate as he turned, but he hadn't investigated further, assuming it was the Sword Master's power. Now it seemed like it wasn't the Sword Master's power, but his own fault, and it seemed to be related to his speed. He attacked again, this time a little slower but more agile. Richardel casually deflected the incoming attack with his sword. His feet moved constantly, but they were only spinning in circles, not moving a single step from their original position. Tony's attack grew more serious. He didn't expect to inflict a single wound on the Sword Master, but the fact that he hadn't moved a single step was disheartening. Suddenly, Richardel moved, no longer remaining in his position. The pressure on Tony suddenly intensified. The offensive and defensive dynamics shifted, and it felt like a dozen or 20 men were surrounding him, each strike aimed at his vitals. Frederick watched in amazement. From the outset, Richardel had employed only basic footwork and swordplay, his strength and speed slightly inferior to Tony's, but even so, he still outclassed him. Tony held out against the relentless barrage for 15 minutes, his physical and mental exhaustion leaving him tempted to give up. He gritted his teeth again, parrying with his shield and sword. He occasionally used his sword as a battering ram, but Richardel slipped out of range mid-strike. 20 minutes later, Tony finally gave up and slumped to the ground, his white shirt soaked with sweat, looking as if he'd just been pulled out of the water. Richardel put away his sword, his forehead devoid of sweat. He said with satisfaction, "Very good. Rest for 2 days, then come find me at the barracks. I'm currently forming a guard to protect Wesson. You can have a place there. How far you can go depends on yourself." Chapter 98, Magic of the East. At dinner time, Richardel, eyeing the main course on the glass plate before him, asked Frederick with interest, "What's up with Gallic food today? Meat pie? Did that little girl send you tulips again?" Cooking food wrapped in dough has a long history, with a rich variety and numerous recipes. Gallic meat pie involves wrapping minced meat in dough, baking it in the oven, and then cutting through the golden puff pastry to reveal the fragrant meat filling. Katie quipped, "I've noticed Frederick is quite popular with girls. There's our Maria, Françoise of Gaul, and Teresa of Osmina, and who knows how many more will be there in the future." Frederick, scowling at the gossipy father and daughter, thought they should switch their meat pie filling to liver, unwashed and unseasoned. Françoise of Gaul is Armand's sister, who visited Wesson last year. Frederick asked Armand to bring her a glass checkers set on his return trip. This spring, the girl reciprocated with a few of the most fashionable Dutch tulips in a letter. Frederick replied with a 3x3 Rubik's Cube. A month later, Françoise replied with a letter of her own, along with her own tulips. Thus, the two became pen pals. This time, Frederick sent a large box of Katie's newly developed colorful notepads and stationery, featuring beautiful patterns, and suggested she become the exclusive distributor for Wesson paper and Gaul. Armand's family was a powerful force in Gaul, well positioned to handle such a large business. After returning from Ansbach, Frederick mentioned Teresa and Pontigant. However, Richard knew Pontigant, an elite member of the Osmagian Empire's Royal Mage Corps, and deduced that Teresa must be a member of the Osmagian royal family. Dinner began as Katie and Richardel exchanged gossip. As the puff pastry was sliced open, a rich aroma filled the dining room. Richardel took a deep breath and asked Frederick in surprise, "What spices are used in this lamb filling? It smells so good." Without waiting for Frederick's reply, he immediately began to devour the food. Not bad, Richardel said with a satisfied smile. "I've eaten a lot of lamb, and compared to other spices, lamb with this is the best. It's cumin." Katie recognized the spice after just 2 bites. You can actually cook lamb, huh? Richardnell's face was filled with surprise. Isn't cumin an herb? Frederick didn't answer, but ate first. Yesterday, he'd visited Friedrich to get him to start researching topical anti-inflammatory drugs, and he'd discovered this herb smelled a bit like cumin, only with a rounder shape. Cumin grows on the southern continent. It has the effect of dispelling cold and treating some gastrointestinal problems. It is also used in some medicines that girls drink. The extracted essential oil can slow down the speed of wound suppuration. It has been proved that it can replace cumin to roast lamb. Psyche sat there quietly eating cumin lamb pie. The one in front of her was a circle bigger than the others, and the meat was also the best part. Needless to say, it must be Frederick who had something to ask for. Sure enough, after dinner, Frederick invited her to take a walk on the top of the mountain outside the castle. After Frederick took over, he had people plant some flowers and plants here, set up stone benches and stone pavilions, and provide a place for the staff in the castle to rest. Tell me, what do you want to do? Psyche sat on a chair from where she could have a bird's-eye view of the city of Wissenberg. Frederick sat down beside her and said with a grin, I'd like to learn about the magic of peach blossom stone. Psyche smiled, a look of as you can imagine, and after tapping him on the head, she said, it's easy to become a tyrant. The magic systems on each side are different, and their development paths are different. Don't even think about mastering anything until you understand the essence of magic. Frederick scratched his head embarrassedly, his little trick seen through. A few days ago, Tony's body turned black during his battle with Richardnell, showing a significant improvement in his physical fitness and defense. So Frederick was a little tempted. Psyche said with amusement, but it's not impossible to learn from each other's strengths and overcome your weaknesses. I know of a body refining magic. If you maintain your virginity for the next 40 or 50 years, Richardnell might not be able to defeat you. Frederick shook his head hastily. Just kidding. If you can't explore the beauty of humanity, what's the point of life? He immediately changed the subject, curiously asking, what's the difference between the two systems? Psyche dropped her antics and spoke seriously. Simply put, the eastern side views magical elements as the essence of the world, prioritizing the unity of the human body with the universe. Therefore, they've developed more and gone further in body cultivation. There are two main schools over there. One uses magical elements to strengthen the body. This is the simplest, and that's what Tony used that day. This school excels in combat, using the strengthened body as a weapon. The other school focuses on strengthening the soul, using it to nourish the body. This is difficult and progress is slow. A single mistake can lead to imminent failure, so there are fewer practitioners, but once they cross that threshold, their strength is extremely strong. She continued, magic here focuses on strengthening mental power to control magical elements and the use of magic arrays, and they're more adept at utilizing magical elements. There's no superiority or inferiority among the various schools, but each has its own emphasis. At the peak of development, they all reach the same goal. Frederick pondered this for a moment, then realized a question and asked in confusion, can the soul nourish the body? That's natural, Psyche replied. This question touches upon the very nature of this world. If there is a creator, I'm afraid only he can clearly explain the underlying principles. But that doesn't prevent us from using this phenomenon. Frederick nodded and said, no wonder you've lived so long and remained so young. That's the power of soul magic. Psyche smirked and asked, have you heard of human transmogrification? Frederick blinked. What's going on? Sun Wukong 72 transformations? There's a kind of human transmogrification in the East, Psyche continued. It allows people to transform into animals, even magical beasts. For example, transforming into a beast to fight, a bird to fly, or a pet to fly for food and drink. This kind of magic also exists in the dark lands to the north, but it's a fixed pattern, limited to a few specific animals. The essence of this magic is that the soul feeds the body, thereby transforming it. It can also be considered a form of soul magic. Frederick blinked. If he could master this, return home, become a national treasure, and live in the zoo, he'd earn at least 20,000 yuan a month. If he also started a live stream to be cute, wouldn't he make a fortune? But let's just forget about that. If one day the number one guy on the list gets the urge to contribute to the National Treasure Breeding Program and broadcasts himself mating with the female national treasures, that wouldn't be fun. But transforming into another animal is still possible, at least it can be useful when running away. Can I learn? Frederick asked. A cunning glint flashed in Psyche's eyes, and she replied seriously, of course, you can. Logically, you should wait until you're at least 18 years old and your soul development is stable, but your soul is gifted, so you can start from the very basics. You need to learn some introductory magic first, to familiarize yourself with the magic of another system, but not now. Give yourself 2 years to build a solid foundation in magic here, so you don't end up being a jack of all trades. Frederick nodded, thinking it was fine. It was normal to start from the easy part and move on to the difficult part. But he still had one most pressing question unasked, so he asked, "Excuse me, is there any magic in the East that allows one to fly by standing on a sword?" Psyche replied, "There are cranes and phoenixes over there, pulling carts." "Isn't that better than a cold wind?" Frederick was stunned for a moment, then thought about it. Psyche patted his head and said, "If you want to visit the East, then develop ships." Chapter 99, Steam Engine appears. After waiting and waiting, the news about the steam engine came. Frederick finished his meditation, changed his clothes immediately, and took a carriage with Alma to the blacksmith shop by the lake near Wiesenberg University. As soon as he got off the carriage, a clicking sound came from the lake, where a lot of people had gathered to watch the excitement. Schmidt and a group of people were carefully observing and recording the operation of the steam engine. Someone was assembling the machine nearby. When Frederick came over, a group of people immediately greeted the principal. "How is it going?" Frederick waved at them and asked Schmidt directly. "Now the steam engine is working, the piston is reciprocating rapidly in the cylinder, the connecting rod drives the crankshaft, and the crankshaft drives the flywheel to rotate rapidly." Almut stepped aside and left the opportunity to the students. Schmidt excitedly declared, "Principal, this machine has been running continuously for a day, and there are no major problems." Frederick nodded in satisfaction, then asked, "What minor issues are there?" Schmidt scratched his head awkwardly and said, "It's mainly leaks at some of the steam connections. The threads and screws are still a little off." Frederick replied, "It's okay. It's not your fault. We can just improve it over time." This problem really wasn't anyone else's fault, it was Frederick's own fault. To reduce the size of the steam engine, he increased the boiler pressure, bringing it up to the level of at least a mid to late 19th century back home. However, the processing technology and the level of the workers hadn't kept pace, so it's no surprise that some problems arose. Schmidt pointed to the most respectably dressed man in the crowd and said, "To fix the leaks, we've enlisted the help of BASF." BASF, knowing this was Schmidt's show today, had been hunkering down, playing it safe. But now that Schmidt had called on him, he naturally took the stage. "Hello, Principal. You look well. You've grown taller lately." BASF greeted Frederick with a cheerful smile upon his appearance. Frederick looked him up and down, then smiled back. "Other people get married, but yours is growing first." The students around him, all of whom knew BASF, burst into laughter, envious. BASF's face beamed with happiness as he replied, "My wife recently bought a cookbook, and her cooking has improved dramatically." He then got down to business. "I came to investigate the leak problem on the steam engine 2 weeks ago. It's mainly because the gaps are too large, allowing high-pressure steam to leak through. I have a slime glue. You can apply it to the threads like glue and tighten them. It fills the gaps, and once it solidifies, it blocks the steam. To dismantle it, you can soften it with a log fire from the outside." Frederick nodded. It was a good idea, but he added, "You need to check the glue frequently to prevent damage from prolonged use." BASF immediately promised to personally monitor the situation. Frederick walked over to the steam engine and examined it closely. It was mounted on a steel frame with 4 steel wheels beneath it, similar in structure to a horse-drawn carriage. The wheels had hooks that could swivel left and right for easy pulling. The boiler was also slightly different, with an outer shell that was transparent front and back. Schmidt explained that this was for insulation to prevent burns. The cylinder was located at the head, attached to the side of the boiler, making it a rather compact structure. Then Frederick noticed a new device, a steel pipe as thick as a football, mounted on the other side of the boiler. One end had a pipe connected to the boiler, and the other to the overhead water tank. "Is this for adding water?" Frederick asked. "Principal, you're wise," Schmidt replied immediately. "This is a water pump. You can add water while the boiler is running. It has magical muscles inside that force water into the boiler. There's a spring-loaded check valve on the pipe that keeps the steam out but allows water in." Frederick nodded. While it wasn't the best solution, with much greater cost and weight, it worked for now. However, this is only a makeshift solution for now. When it's actually manufactured and sold, Such a water injector wouldn't work. Frederick stood there for a long time, his brow furrowed slightly, recalling Bernoulli's equation, which he'd learned in his hydraulic studies in a previous life. Bernoulli's equation is P plus G equals C here. P is the pressure at a point in the fluid, V is the velocity at that point, Greek letter O is the fluid density, G is the acceleration due to gravity, H is the height at that point, and C is a constant. In a continuous system, this equation can be expressed as P plus G equals P plus G. In other words, the greater the flow rate, the lower the pressure, the lower the flow rate, the higher the pressure. During water injection, water vapor enters the water injector. Because of the high flow rate and low pressure, the water near the steam outlet is sucked away by it, and the water is carried along by the steam into the water inlet. The water and steam mix in the mixing nozzle behind the water inlet. At this point, most of the water vapor condenses, and the mixed water gains the kinetic energy of the steam. Simultaneously, the diameter of this section of the pipe gradually decreases, like a bell mouth, increasing the water flow rate before entering the water ejector at high speed. The diameter of the water jet was like a bell. As the pipe grew larger, the velocity of the mixed water decreased, while the pressure increased, ultimately pushing open the check valve and entering the boiler. Schmidt, observing the principal lost in thought, had already been waiting with a notebook and charcoal pencil. As soon as Frederick raised his hand, both items were immediately presented. For now, he had merely documented the relationship between flow velocity and pressure. Years later, Bernoulli's principle would become known in this world as the Wesson principle of fluid flow. This water jet had a simple structure but complex design. Its use required a low pressure within the boiler, but overall, it was a good solution. Later, people tried to understand why Frederick had grasped this principle at that age. The generally accepted theory was that he understood the relationship between pipe diameter and flow velocity from rinsing his mouth, and the relationship between velocity and pressure from watching the wind lift a skirt or tablecloth. This last essay, depicting young Frederick's keen observation and reflection, became a required elementary school text. Frederick, still unaware of what lay ahead, now thought about finding a graphite pencil after completing the schematic for the water jet. Charcoal pencils were always difficult to use. Schmidt took the notebook with both hands as if it were the most precious treasure in the world, promising to begin researching it tomorrow. Frederick's prestige among the scholars at Wittenberg University was gradually built up in this way. He continued studying the instruments beside the boiler. The pressure gauge, thermometer, and water level gauge showed normal readings. The water level gauge used the same technology as the P-gun to indicate the presence of a bullet in the chamber, a float in the boiler connected to different magical circuits, causing the corresponding crystals on the outside to illuminate. Most importantly, this steam engine used a control core originally used for golem puppets, which all might call the magic brain. This core comprehensively controlled the entire machine, including boiler pressure, exhaust pressure, and water addition. This allowed even an ordinary farmer to control the machine with a simple instruction. Because of its simple functions, the price was not high. Schmidt whispered to Frederick, "Principal, the magic brain has a special function." Frederick asked curiously, "What function?" "Self-destruction," Schmidt said in a low voice. Frederick nodded with great satisfaction, and then said, "It would be best if it could be controlled remotely." Chapter 100 Excellent Flour. Frederick walked around the steam engine twice and found that it was better than he expected. The cylinder leakage problem that he was most worried about was not beyond the acceptable range. He suddenly remembered a question and turned to ask Schmidt, who was following him, "How do you plan to clean the scale in the boiler?" Schmidt immediately replied, "Use the acid extracted from acid slime. When it is diluted to a certain extent, it will have little corrosion to metal and can still remove scale." Then he pointed to a pipe under the boiler and said, "This is the drain, which can drain the clean scale. I have a suggestion. Disassemble it and check it every 3 months." Frederick nodded with satisfaction, and asked, "Has the power been tested?" "It has been tested." Schmidt pointed to the mountain in the distance and said, "We conducted a test on the edge of a cliff. We used 100 ordinary adult draft horses to pull heavy objects for 1 minute. We obtained 1,000 sets of data and finally calculated the average number. Then we did the same experiment with the steam engine and finally got the data. Currently, the steam engine has 20 times horsepower under normal working conditions, and can reach 25 times horsepower at maximum working pressure." Frederick said with satisfaction, "Very good, very well done. In the future, when advertising, we will promote according to the horsepower multiples. At this time, The machines near the steam engine had been installed. First, 4 vertical steel mills were mounted on elevated platforms. Their main components were cast iron, housing 2 steel grinding wheels. The fixed grinding wheels could be adjusted in distance from the rotating grinding wheels via screws. Then, beneath the platforms were 4 vibrating screens, each with a screen made of steel wire. Drawing metal using dies and hot drawing wires is nothing new, it's long been used in gold and silver jewelry manufacturing. The invention of the magic reciprocating machine naturally led to its use in drawing iron and steel wire. The steam engine was temporarily stopped to supply air to the cylinders. A belt connected the flywheel to a long steel shaft mounted horizontally on a dedicated platform. The mills and vibrating screens drew power from the steel shaft via the belt. Once everything was ready, the steam engine started, and the machines it powered began to operate. Someone continuously poured clean wheat into the inlet of the first mill. Soon, bran and broken wheat kernels could be seen emerging from the outlet. These kernels were then fed through a large, transparent hose into the vibrating screen to remove the bran. The sieved broken wheat was then manually carried to the next mill for further grinding. After a set of preparations, fine, clean legendary flour appeared before Frederick. "This is the best flour in the world," Schmidt proudly declared to Frederick. "It takes 100 kilograms of wheat to produce only 70 kilograms, Frederick nodded with immense satisfaction. The king had never tasted such fine flour. Like him, he usually only ate fine flour with an 80% yield, and only used epic flour with a 75% yield for important banquets. The vast majority of flour sold on the market was excellent flour with an 85% yield, ordinary flour with a 90% yield, or coarse flour with bran." Schmidt's subtle thoughts couldn't be hidden from Frederick. The water-powered mills in Wessenland were owned by Frederick and his vassal families, and the appearance of this flour was a death sentence for them. Frederick had Alfu come by tomorrow to open a large flour mill and share the fruits of his labor. He then asked Schmidt, "Where will this machine be tested next?" Schmidt, knowing his sales pitch had worked, happily replied, "We're sending it to the smelter to power the boiler bellows." Frederick nodded, but thought using a steam engine to power the bellows was overkill, so he said, "Bring me a pen and paper." The magic reciprocating engine had previously provided insufficient speed, but now the steam engine was sufficient, allowing for better air supply equipment. A centrifugal blower wasn't a problem for him. His family's honeycomb briquette stove had used one as a child, and he'd disassembled it many times. He could also build a centrifugal water pump, as he'd installed water pumps on a construction site in his previous life and was quite familiar with it. The biggest difference between the two was the blades, but he only remembered that blower blades could be straight, while water pump blades were curved. He also needed to carefully experiment and research the volute size and shaft seals. Both devices were simple to build, and cast iron was sufficient for everything except the bearings and main shaft. His reputation at the University of Wiesenberg thus rose. Seeing Frederick's cheerful expression, Schmidt said, "Principal, I need to trouble you with something." "What is it?" Frederick was pondering the feed business beside a vibrating screen. "Is there a girl you like but are too embarrassed to tell me, and you'd like me to help you out?" Schmidt exclaimed, "Is that even possible?" But he quickly got back to business. "Well, Buderus has a plan for building a factory and is looking for investment." Although Frederick didn't know who Buderus was, he said, "Then have him bring it." Schmidt waved toward the crowd, and a young man immediately presented a plan. Frederick flipped through it and saw that it was a system for steaming large quantities of food using a low-pressure boiler to centrally supply steam to multiple high-pressure steamers. It was suitable for kitchens and restaurants in crowded areas like schools, military bases, ports, and factories. Buderus gave Schmidt a look, and Schmidt immediately said to Frederick, "President, I think Buderus's system is quite good. We could use it in our university cafeteria." Frederick didn't react, his expression unchanged. Buderus, a little anxious, quickly signaled to the crowd, and then BASF joined him. "President," BASF said with a smile, "Buderus's system is quite good. With some upgrades, it could replace the pressure cooker we use to produce slime. Direct steam is much more convenient than using fire." Frederick still didn't respond. He calmly closed his proposal and said, "I understand." Buderus' heart skipped a beat, thinking it was doomed. With the success of BASF, Schmidt, and others, and with everyone knowing the president was wealthy, many people submitted the proposals to the president, hoping to get a startup loan. But these proposals disappeared like mud thrown into a lake. Frederick grabbed a handful of legendary flour and, in a moment of playful excitement, unleashed a small tornado from his hand, sucking in the flower. He then tossed it into the air, and as the flower dissipated into a puff of white smoke, he threw a small fireball at it, instantly exploding into a blaze. The people present were startled, and Frederick said to them, "I'll be going back now." All Might followed him into the carriage and chatted for a moment before asking, "Principal, why have you been tightening your investment recently?" Frederick turned his head to gaze out the window at the shimmering river. He said calmly, "Money has value only when it flows like water, but where water flows is crucial. It can become a stagnant pool and eventually dry up. I told you I was going to open a bank. Once that banker comes to me and agrees to work for me, I'll have him review the proposals and handle the loans." All Might breathed a sigh of relief, saying, "That's good." Frederick asked, "Why, are you looking for investment too?" "Indeed," All Might said proudly. "The good thing you once promised has come to fruition." End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.